Hallelujah. Let Lord Jesus Christ shine forth. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us. Welcome to live stream with DCCI Ministries. And this evening, I've got the privilege of hosting a debate between Mary Harp and Robert Spencer, whether Mohammed existed. So Mary Harp is going to take the position that yes, Mohammed existed, versus Robert Spencer is holding the position Mohammed did not exist. Let me just say hi to them and then we get on with it. Mary, how are you doing?
I am doing very well, and I want to thank everybody for being here. I especially want to thank Robert Spencer for coming. He gave me more time than I'd hoped that I would get. I have been a follower and great admirer of his work since the Blogging the Quran series that he did on Hot Air, which was a while ago. So, and I also want to thank you, Hatun, for hosting and for being patient with us. I would like to invite people to subscribe to Reasoned Answers channel, which is hosted by Thaddeus, where I also stream. And if you can make it, please meet us at the Seek Share Truth Conference in Ohio next week. Me, Thaddeus, Hatun will be there, and so will David Wood. And maybe Robert Spencer will make it some year.
No.
Thank you very much for joining us, Mary. Robert Spencer, how are you doing? Peace of Christ be with you, sir.
Thank God, very well. Thank you for doing this, Hatun. It's a very important issue, and I appreciate any chance to discuss it. Word is getting out now, and it's making a big difference. And so this is an issue that people might not realize immediately why it's so important, but I think by the end of this, they will.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for being here and making yourself available. I am very much aware both of you are very busy, so it's good we are finally able to do this. And thank you very much, everyone in the chat who is watching, listening, observing. Joining the debate, please bring up your questions and then tag DCCI Ministries in front of your question, that at the end of the debate, I will be posing your questions. And then tell us who you are asking your question. Please, don't just leave the question hanging there. Make sure I know who is question addressed to. So debate structure is going to be 20 minutes of opening statement on the topic of did Mohammed exist? 15 minutes of rebuttal of 3 rounds, and then 5 minutes of closing statement followed by with question and answer. Mary is going to go first to make a case that Mohammed existed, and Robert Spencer will go second. If I understood correctly, let me introduce the debaters. So, Too Many Marys. She's been studying Islamic materials for 17 years. Yes, she still looks very young. And she does live streams with Reasoned Answer, as she expressed, so check them out over there. On the other side, we've got Robert Spencer, known as the author of the Critical Quran and biography of Muhammad as well. He's the gentleman behind a Jihad Watch website, as well as This Week in Jihad. So check the website as well as the YouTube channel to kind of observe what's happening in this broken world by lovely Muslims. Okay, ready to go?
Yes.
Okay, so Mary will go first. Just practical things. As debate goes on the side, you will see time is counting down. I will give you 1 minute warning to each, and then when your time is up, it's up. I can't do much about it. I'll kind of give you a couple of seconds for you to come to the dot or the comma. Otherwise, I will be muting you. Anything is not clear? Speak now or shush forever.
It's clear. Just make sure that my presentation gets up.
Okay. Mary, you are ready to go?
Mm-hmm.
Let me first. Okay, Robert Spencer is muted. Mary's presentation is up there, and your 20 minutes starts.
I assert that the sources for Islam have typical levels of historical reliability for the types of sources that they are. It follows that the best approach for early Islam is normative historical methodology that unites all available sources and evaluates their content in context in the usual fashion. I believe it is important to do this first in the interest of truth, but secondly, when people don't recognize when and where this work was produced, they put on interpretive lenses that filter out what the sources are saying and instead allow very modern Islamicist apologetic interpretations to replace the words and meaning found in the Quran, the classical sources, and the post-classical sources. We need to hold Islam responsible for the content of its sources. I am not endorsing unique Islamic methodologies or the acceptance of any material uncritically. I'm endorsing the treatment of the Islamic corpus as we treat any similar body of work, such as the material about Alexander the Great. Just as we recognize that the surviving material about Alexander is based on real prior histories that are referenced but now lost, we must recognize as real the sources that Islamic writers explicitly say they depend on. Using normative historical methods, we will not arrive at the great authentic prophet of a real God Allah, but we will have a largely clear and accurate view of a self-proclaimed prophet with the written form of the name Muhammad. He was from the village of Mecca in the Hijaz. This was the site of one of the few surviving stone idol shrines that had been common among pagans in the Iron Age from Turkey to Yemen. After he was expelled, he moved to Medina in 622 and began the jihad against the world that continues to this day, and he is the primary source of today's Quranic text. Let's start with the name Muhammad and where we find it in Islam in our sources. Where we find it before Islam in our sources. This name is recorded among ordinary pagan Arab men in the pre-Islamic Hijaz. The exact written form is also found in several old South Arabian inscriptions as a variant of some much more common names with the same root. I want to focus on one of these inscriptions. This is a tombstone of a man with the written form of Muhammad's name who is calling on an old South Arabian pagan god to curse anyone who messes with his grave. It's dated to the 4th century or earlier, before the arrival of Judaism in this region. This is a very common type of inscription that we find in the ancient Near East. I included another example here. It must be emphasized how important it is for these inscriptions to write the person's name correctly, because this is how their memory was preserved. While stone inscriptions are the gold standard for evidence for this region at this time, a tombstone would be even more reliable than other kinds of inscriptions. And here we find Muhammad's written name belonging to an ordinary dead pagan man. Before the rise of Islam, we find this name in no other region. It is also never used as a title. To emphasize this point, this written form has no recorded usage as a name or a title among Jews or Christians who spoke any of the North Semitic languages, including Hebrew, Syriac, and Aramaic. It is a regular name. It was first used by pagans, and it appeared only in Arabic and the old South Arabian languages, where we should expect it with a historical Muhammad. Its form is also interesting. The Shada form, written in English with 2 M's, suggests that the original language may have been the old South Arabian Minian language. Secular history tells us that the first kingdom to control the Hijaz was the Minian kingdom. Early Islamic sources inadvertently provide evidence that the first god of the Kaaba was a Minian high god Wad. This puts the Kaaba and Muhammad in the Hijaz, or very close to it. In the Islamic sources, we find that Muhammad's grandfather refused him the family name Qatham, maybe even taking it from him. This is spun as Muhammad being too special for such an ordinary name, but we can suss out from the sources that it's because his grandfather believed him to be illegitimate and instead gave him a man's name connected to the other tribes living around Mecca, basically saying, one of those guys is really your father, so I'm giving you one of their names. So Muhammad's name already places him as an ordinary man in the peninsula of Arabia. It even suggests the Hijaz. We're already seeing a pattern that will only get clearer. The content and context of the sources support a singular Hijazi man who is a self-declared prophet to be the ultimate origin of Islam. Let's evaluate a critical issue that arises when an alternative to historical singular man Muhammad is claimed. How would a mythical Muhammad been created and promoted? And how would people come to believe in him instead of in their own real history? Muhammad mythicists who reject normative historical methods propose that the Islamic figure Muhammad was a rewriting of history, usually placing this event during the classical period. Robert himself explicitly endorses this view. This rewriting would be for the purposes of forging a national identity. Authorities would have taken up ref legends about multiple figures, folk history, prophetic expectations, and/or fragments from various religious documents and shaped them into something new. The first text for this, the Quran, was necessarily created in or disseminated from a central location in their theory. The same Muhammad mythicists who demand continuous documentation from Muhammad's birth to the Abbasid state, surviving in period manuscripts, will not be able to provide any of this for their own theories, nor are they able to provide the kind of evidence that normative historical methodology demands. Mainstream historians freely acknowledge that the Quran has no knowledge of any Jewish or Christian scripture or other religious text in a written form. It is able to access them only through oral retellings, which is precisely what Muhammad's contemporaries accuse him of in the Quran itself. Yet Muhammad mythicists stipulate that the Quran, as we have it now, was, at minimum, extensively edited into an unrecognizably new text and religion in a literate environment with knowledge of Jewish and Christian writings. To emphasize, this new text would have had to have been approved of in and disseminated from Syria and or Mesopotamia, the power centers of the classical caliphate. This is a highly literate area where Jewish and Christian religious texts were in constant use. Yet the Quran did not make use of these, even while it claims it matches the canonical texts. And because it doesn't match and claims it does, it falsifies itself in a way that any interested person could discover for themselves. Let's examine several examples of self-falsification, beginning with how the Quran argues for the authenticity of Muhammad. According to the Quran, Muhammad is prophesied in the scriptures of the Jews and Christians, such that they recognize him as they recognize their sons. What does this mean? Ibn Kathir gives the consensus handed-down understanding that Allah said the Jews and Christians know, present tense, Muhammad, based on the news and information they have, present tense, from the previous messengers and prophets, that is, in Scripture. This includes his physical description. The only element of the description of Muhammad mentioned explicitly in the classical Islamic sources as being in the scriptures of the Jews and Christians is Muhammad's large, hairy mole. The existence of the mole, its appearance, and its location on his back were supposed to be known to Jews and Christians in their scriptures. So where is anything that could plausibly be a prophet with a holy mole in the previous scriptures? It doesn't exist. Likewise, the Quran attempts to cite words of Jesus, but invents something new instead of adapting something that exists in Christian scripture. And the confident assertion that the scriptures with the Jews and Christians clearly predict a Gentile or unlettered prophet is also untrue. It follows that a story of a holy mole would be invented by a 7th century self-declared Hijazi prophet if he really had a mole. It would serve the purpose for this man of changing this mark from the kind of thing people normatively associate with demons to a proof that he really was a prophet. And no 7th century Hijazi Arab had access to Jewish or Christian scriptures and a language they could understand to contradict him. This was such an important part of Muhammad's prophetic claims that there are many lavish descriptions of this mole from his immediate followers that are carried through into the most highly respected hadith material, repeated with emphasis through the end of the 15th century. It is not plausible for powers of the classical caliphate to invest in such a suspicious mole story, or to promote new words for Christ, or to rely on a non-existent prophecy. The caliphate existed in a context where the Jewish and Christian scriptures were readily available to reference, to evaluate truth claims about them. These claims were not only easy to disprove, but made Islam look foolish to anyone with a basic familiarity of either set of scriptures. It follows that it is not plausible that the caliphate is responsible for the contents of the Quran in a significant way, and the contents of later materials like the Ahadith and the Sirat literature were also constrained to support historical events that people widely remembered and transmitted. Let's move on to the Quran. Why is it true according to its own main argument? The Quran is supposed to be true because it confirms, verifies, certifies, proves true the scripture that is currently with the Jews and Christians, between their hands, in front of them. In the Quran, the scripture of the Christians and the Jews is called reliable by Allah, who demands that they rely upon it because it will lead them to affirm that they recognize Muhammad and recognize the scripture that he brings as identical to their own. The Quran is supposed to give the same revelation that is in other scriptures, all from the same heavenly book, just in different languages. This is only evidence if it's true, but also if everyone already accepts as true that this book can't plausibly be a human copy or translation. The argument rests on two pillars. One, the inaccessibility of the matching text requiring a miracle for a match to occur, and two, that it really does match. A Muhammad from Mecca would not have access to Jewish and Christian scriptures, and neither would his followers, so he could be confident in not being held accountable for what he claimed about them. Therefore, it worked for him in his context, but it doesn't match what it claims it does, and so it self-falsifies to anyone in a more educated context. The argument that the Quran gives for its authenticity, which later Hadith and Sirah material supports, demonstrates that the classical caliphate state did not create or choose to promote the canonical Quran or Mohammedan accounts. Instead, it was saddled with them. In fact, the clear false claims of the Quran caused serious problems from the lifetime of Muhammad forward. To sidestep these issues, the classical caliphate was forced to forbid Muslims from reading Jewish and Christian scriptures. They were also forced to declare that a non-Muslim who read or studied the Quran was under a death sentence. Non-Muslims could only hope to learn what they might happen to overhear. You had to convert before you found out what was in the Quran, and once you did, you would be killed if you left. This shows that the caliphate knew that the Quran was not only not persuasive to outsiders, they knew that the Quran also invited Muslims themselves to apostasy if they were permitted to examine its claims. Yet this is the Quran that Mohammed mythicists claim that the caliphate is responsible for the purposes of strengthening the state and providing rhetorical arguments for its new religion. All right. The historical evidence shows that the Quran itself was compiled shortly after Muhammad's death in largely the form we have now. This is proven by the Sanaa manuscript, whose lower text can be confidently dated before 669. This damaged manuscript preserves a fifth of the modern Quran, yet contains no variants that are greater than the length of a phrase. Within its surviving text blocks, there are no extra verses or missing verses, and the verses are in the same order. That doesn't mean there are no variants. In fact, the Sanaa has 61 compared to the Hafs version most popular now, which would work out to about 300 across a complete manuscript. These kinds of variants are not the kind of thing that the classical scholars were unaware of or that they tried to conceal. Rather, we have people like Muqatil trying to systematically document every variant beginning in the 8th century, a project that continued past the classical age. This is evidence that the Quran was originally recorded by various scribes as the dictated words of Muhammad, which he sometimes did not remember exactly the same in different reciting sessions, despite the manuscripts he had to help his memorizing. This is evidence against the idea that the Quranic text was a later concoction. If the text is novel, there should be no phrase-level variants to record. Instead, the scholars should be so lax in their view of what is proper Quran that they wouldn't notice even a substantial change. Furthermore, if they were part of the group who concocted it, then they would not invent minor variants to cast doubt on their own work. It's these word-level and phrase-level variants that were marginalized by the central authority, yet none of them gives us a book that is different in its basic content and message about theology or the state. Before and after standardization, the Quran was, for any historian, the same basic book. The greatest difference in manuscripts concerned 5 short prayers and whether they should be called Quran or something else. Their existence and their divine authenticity were not debated, only their inclusion in a Quran manuscript. The sources that Muhammad mythicists like to depend on to claim that the Quran was a flexible text that existed in many forms instead show that it existed from the outset in slightly different but very rigid versions. People fought hard against giving up their 2 extra prayers. This is the opposite of people who would accept a radically different Quran. Returning to the contents of the sources, they reveal that it must come from the context of a place like the real historical Mecca, which was poor, undeveloped, and had no agriculture or detailed knowledge of how people and civilization lived. This is formative to the ideas of the world expressed in the Islamic sources. We know that early Mecca had no cultivated plants, which the Quran explicitly says is true of the location where his holy temple is that he claimed that Abraham built. In fact, the Quran knows so little about agriculture that Allah claims to have created all food-producing plants in mated pairs, boy wheat and girl wheat, boy date trees and girl date trees. They mate and the girls bear fruit, the same as animals. Thus, the Quran could not have been produced in an agricultural context, which excludes Syria, Mesopotamia, and even oases from being the first context for the content of the book. Furthermore, the Quran and the Ahadith attributed to Muhammad have no knowledge of perennial rivers. Instead, the Quran thinks that rivers are underground flows of water that occasionally pop up into oases. Even the rivers of paradise don't flow over the land. This places the Quran among a people who are isolated from areas with knowledge of rivers, which would exclude Mesopotamia and the Levant. Muhammad's paradise promises palaces for its inhabitants, but the floors of these palaces will still be made of dirt. They will be really nice dirt, The dirt will be made out of musk, but they will still be dirt floors. This places the Quran in the context of the mind of a person who couldn't imagine a house that had floors made of anything but dirt. Islamic sources clearly record that Muhammad's fear of toilet demons kept the Muslims from using latrines of the Medinans for years. Instead, he kept to the primitive Bedouin practice of defecating outside that is reported as being practiced at Mecca. This isn't an isolated report, but provides the context for Islamic law to this day. It directly led to Umar manipulating Allah into revealing the verse of the hijab by harassing women who were out defecating by night in the fields. If you have no primitive Meccan toilet habits, you would have no hijab today. All of this because Muhammad was a historical figure from a historical place that fits Mecca. Islam is also permanently shaped by Muhammad getting repeatedly tricked by the Jews of Medina, according to the Islamic sources themselves. These reports belong to a context where Muhammad and his followers don't realize he was tricked. A Jewish woman tricked Muhammad into teaching that people get tortured in the grave, and the primary reason is because of urine. The Jews got him to include the stories of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus and the Alexander romance in the Quran and claim that they're in the Torah too. The Jews got Allah to say that they accurately know things about the ruh, or spirit, that Allah won't tell Muhammad or put in the Quran. They got the Quran to state that people accurately know how long the sleepers slept and how many there are, but the Quran itself is unable to say which report is true. That Muhammad failed, or at least some of these tests, is transparent to anyone with a basic Jewish or Christian education in late antiquity, and it is even suggested by the sources internally themselves. The fact that these events remain intact points to an authentic failure of a charismatic leader who was able to wave it off and deny it to his devoted followers. But this failure is one that they nevertheless recorded and transmitted because it is a true event that they were able to falsely contextualize as a success only because of their location and lack of knowledge. In this time, we have explored just a few pieces in the vast body of evidence that together points to a historical Muhammad. Every piece of evidence, textual or otherwise, consists of its content, and it comes from a specific context. When you instead try to force material into an artificial model, you lose the understanding of it. You erase the man who went around telling people that his mole proves he is a prophet, and the Jewish and Christian scriptures say so. You erase the Quranic author's certainty that it had the same contents as contemporary canonical Jewish and Christian scriptures. If you deny that Muhammad was a form of an ordinary existing name, you endorse the view that something special is at work if a child was given this name and grew up to claim to be a prophet. By discounting Mecca, you erase the Quran's mistakes about agriculture and its ignorance about how rivers work, and you deny that Muslims honor a genuinely pre-existing stone idol at a pagan shrine that is in no way unique among many other Iron Age pagan shrines.
55 seconds.
The content and context of the materials concerning Muhammad do not indicate that they are a product of the 8th to 10th century caliphate. Rather, the materials yield innumerable threads of data that weave together to create a stark tapestry of a 7th century self-proclaimed Arabian prophet who hails from a Hijazi pagan shrine with no first-hand knowledge of the Jewish or Christian scriptures that he invokes in order to validate himself and his supposed holy book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. You still had 18 seconds. Thank you very much. And Robert Spencer, you will be up for next 20 minutes. Can you kindly unmute yourself? Thank you very much. And those of you who are watching us online, thank you very much for being here. If you do have any questions regarding the topic has been debated, please tag the CCI Ministries in front of your question and then tell us who you are asking your question. At the end, I will be bringing up your questions. Robert Spencer, you've got 20 minutes. Let me know when you are ready to go. So I'll start the timing.
Go ahead.
God.
Thank you very much, Mary. Very interesting presentation. The claim, however, that the Hadith and Sirah is generally historically reliable about Muhammad's life does not explain some very important anomalies. For example, just a few of them here. If Muhammad was named Muhammad, as the standard narrative tells us, then why would anyone make up a story about his originally being named Kutam, as Ibn Sa'd records? Ibn Sa'd at the same time denies this and says nobody really takes this seriously, and yet it is something in the tradition. Now, it makes no sense if you have a boy born and he's named Muhammad and he grows up and he's all known as Muhammad throughout his life, that somebody would invent such a story of him originally having another name. If, on the other hand, there were stories about a Kutam that were eventually folded into the Muhammad myth as it was being constructed, it would make sense to also fabricate an explanation accounting for the persistence of this other name in some of the circulating literature. The same thing can be said for Seraphel, the angel, who originally appears to Muhammad according to other traditions that Ibn Sa'd also records. And he says he was replaced by Gabriel after 3 years. And yet you go to the standard madrasa and get the standard story about Muhammad today. Gabriel is the one who appears to him all the way through. Why would anybody make up this story of Seraphel unless perhaps there were stories about somebody getting prophecies from an angel Seraphel that were included in the Muhammad myth? Also, second, coins minted by the Arabs in their new empire and dating from the 640s and 650s feature the word Muhammad with a cross. Now, you said in your opener that there was no evidence of this name being used as a title. Actually, that's not the case, because in Yemen in 518 AD, in the Yemeni city of Najran, there was an inscription that the Jewish king Yusuf Asar Yatar put there after he defeated Christian forces in the area of Najran. And he wrote, carved into the rock, "O Lord of the Jews, by the praiseworthy one," which is Rabhad bin Mahmud, that Mehmet, that is Muhammad, the praiseworthy one. And obviously it's not referring to the prophet of Islam or to any ordinary man, but actually is a title being used for God. In any case, the coins minted in the Arab Empire in the 640s and 650s, that is, according to the standard story, during the caliphates of Umar and Uthman, who were both Sahaba, both companions of Muhammad, they have the word Muhammad along with a cross. Now, this is very strange because Umar and Uthman are supposed to be companions of Muhammad. They're supposed to have been with him for much of his public ministry as a prophet. And consequently, they may have even been present when he got the revelation of chapter 4, verse 157. They did not kill or crucify him, but it appeared so to them. And they may have been present when he got the revelation about how Jesus will return at the last day and break the cross, kill the pigs, and abolish the jizya. If they weren't present, then they almost certainly heard these stories from other people who were present at the time. And then we're supposed to believe that 10 or 20 years later, they put crosses on their coins with the great name of the prophet. Now, this strains credulity. It actually only makes sense if the stories about the cross, Jesus not having been crucified, the crucifixion being an insult to Allah's power, and Jesus coming back and breaking the cross, if those stories had not been invented yet, then it would make sense. One Islamic apologist that I was talking about this with once said that, no, this was actually because the Arab conquerors had a very light touch. They were gentle and conciliatory toward, toward the Christians they had conquered. And so as an outreach gesture to them, they put the cross on the coins. But of course, we know that throughout history, the Islamic empires have never behaved in such a manner. They have always been, as the Quran directs them in chapter 48, verse 29, ruthless to the unbelievers and merciful to one another. So it's much more likely that Umar and Uthman put crosses along with Muhammad on the coins simply because they had no awareness of any prohibition on the cross. The standard narrative would require that the Quran was complete by the year 632 and collected together into more or less its form today by 653. And that's the Uthmanic recension that you mentioned. Yet John of Damascus in the 730s writes the name of the Islamic prophet in Greek as Mohammed instead of the usual Greek form that is in use today, Muhammad, suggesting that by that time the figure of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, was actually not yet fully formed. He also says that this Muhammad wrote many ridiculous books, to each one of which he set a title. And he says, for example, there's this book on women. That's Surah 4, of course. He also names the book of the cow, which is Surah 2. And he says, then there is the book, The Camel of Allah, which of course is not in the Quran. And he gives no indication of it having a different status from the others. And he also suggests very strongly, seems to assume that these are separate books, not chapters of a single book. And those who object, of course, at this point that the Bible is many books, they also were indeed separate books and were collected together. That's actually what the word Biblia means, books, plural. But the Quran, according to the standard narrative, was always one book, the perfect copy of the eternal mother of the book in paradise, as mentioned in chapters 1339 and 43:4 of the Quran. And it's not only St. John of Damascus who thinks of the Islamic literature as separate books. The first reference to the Quran by a non-Muslim occurred in the year 710, which is 80 years after the book was supposedly completed and 60 years after it was supposedly collected and distributed. And during a debate with an Arab nobleman, this Christian monk of the monastery of Beth Hale, and there are two of those, one of them's in northern Iraq and the other's in Arabia. We don't know which one this guy was in. But in any case, he refers to the Quran by name, first time. And the monk says, I think that for you too, not all of your laws and commandments are in the Quran, which Muhammad taught you. Rather, there are some which he taught you from the Quran, and there are some in Surah Al-Baqarah and in Injil and in Torah, that is the gospel in the Torah. Now, Surah Al-Baqarah, of course, is chapter 2 of the Quran. Why would he refer to it as distinct from the Quran if it's right there in the beginning of the Quran, right after the Fatiha? The only explanation, of course, is that it wasn't in the Quran at that time. Now, there are several other things that I anticipated you're saying, but you didn't say. So I'll save those for later in case you say them. Now, in terms of the mole and all that, I don't see how that's an argument for Muhammad's veracity as a historical figure at all. And I do have to emphasize that I am talking about the existence of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. There's no way to determine the existence or non-existence of any human being. There may have been some guy who did some of the things that Muhammad did. He may even have had this name. It's possible. But the figure of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, as delineated in the Hadith and Sirah literature, there's no historical evidence for him. Now, this mole story, we only have it, we should remember, not from 7th century literature, but from 9th century literature. And nobody seemed to be embarrassed by it or find it absurd that there was no story of a prophet with a mole on his back who was coming in either the Jewish or the Christian scriptures when it began circulating in the 9th century. And so it's hard to see how that establishes that this is something that the leaders of the caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, were stuck with, since it really didn't cause them any trouble. This is actually the origin of the claim that persists to this day, as we know, and has been quite a controversy lately, that the Jews and Christians actually corrupted their scriptures. And so whatever prophecies that the Hadith or Sirah literature want to adduce about their prophet and claim that these are things that the Jews and Christians know and they have in their scriptures, they're really just an indictment of the Jews and Christians even in the fact that they don't have them in their scriptures, that they actually dared to change their scriptures. And so this is, there's no problem there in regard, nothing there establishes the existence of Muhammad as a genuine individual. The Sanaa manuscript, likewise, it may indeed date from 669, although actually most people date it from somewhat later. But it's also not established in any of the content of it that it's actually the Quran itself. But it could be some proto-Quran. Since it's not complete, we don't know what else it was connected to. We don't know what book it was, or if it was the Quran at all. There was an interesting thing that happened some years ago. I wrote Did Muhammad Exist? In 2010, if my memory serves me well. And then a lot of things happened in the intervening 10 years, 15 years now, to make me think about 5 years ago that I needed to revise and expand the book. And one of the things that happened was that there was a fragment of the Quran that was discovered, and it was dated from between 570 and 645. Carbon dating. And so a lot of Muslims started emailing me and saying, you see, this was, and because a lot of the media reports about this early manuscript of the Quran were actually saying this could have been Muhammad's personal copy of the Quran, which of course was just completely fanciful and based on no evidence at all, just total wishful thinking. But the people who wrote me were saying, oh, you have to withdraw your book now and apologize, because this makes it clear that the Quran is very early. And actually, I thought, well, I do need to revise the book. And I did ultimately do that and include discussion of this manuscript and other matters that had not yet come up at the time of the first edition, because the carbon dating was giving the possibility of the manuscript actually dating from before Islam. That if it said between 570 and 645. So if the manuscript actually dated from between 570 and 610, then it comes from before the story, the standard narrative tells us that Muhammad started receiving revelations. If that's possible, then it wasn't Quran at all. It was some book that was used to create the Quran and to fashion it into the things that the Quran says today. And so you really the old manuscripts, they don't establish anything either. Now, another big problem that you have is that none of the material that we know about Muhammad, none of it comes from the 7th century. None of it comes from the 8th century. The first biography that we have of Muhammad, of course, famously everybody knows, was written by Ibn Ishaq, who died in the 770s. So it must date from 750s, 760s. That already is 125 years or more from the date that Muhammad is supposed to have lived. But we don't have Ibn Ishaq either. When Alfred Guillaume published his famous book that everybody studied in college, that is purported to be Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah, the life of Muhammad, it is actually not Ibn Ishaq at all, which is lost. We only have Ibn Ishaq in the recension of Ibn Hisham, who died in 833. We only have the biographical material in the Hadith from around the middle of the 9th century as well, because that's when Bukhari and Muslim and the other people were supposed to have been writing. We don't even have that, however. We don't have 9th century manuscripts of those writings. We only have them from several hundred years even after that. And consequently, there's a tremendous possibility, and indeed a certainty, 100% certainty of legendary elaboration. And why do I say 100% certainty? Because We see it. If you compare stories that appear in both Ibn Hisham and Waqidi, who wrote just right around the same time as Ibn Hisham, or a trifle later, you see that Waqidi has a great deal more detail, and he knows a whole lot more about what happened than Ibn Hisham does. And you gotta wonder, how is it that he came to this knowledge that Ibn Hisham does not have? Let me see if I can find. Yes, you should have had it ready first. Actually, I didn't think I was going to get into this, but I don't have a ready example. I will look for an example while you're rebutting and refuting everything that I'm saying now. But in any case, the stories that we have as they go on, you know, when Ibn Hisham tells a story, Waqidi tells a story, and then Tabari tells the same story. Maybe Ibn Kathir tells the story a few centuries later in his tafsir. They all know more than the last guy. They all have greater detail than the last guy. And this is a clear indication. It's not a situation where they were in a position to interview eyewitnesses. They're hundreds of years removed from what happened. And so it's very clear that what we're talking about is legendary elaboration. And that indicates that the legendary elaboration is virtually certain to have also happened in the gap between 632 and 200 years later, when these stories start appearing. Now, granted, you could say that we're talking about oral cultures here. We're talking about people with prodigious memories that was taken for granted, and that's true. You know, people memorized Homer's Iliad and Odyssey that are very lengthy poems. And so why couldn't they memorize huge expanses of Muhammad's teachings and transmit them over 200 years? The problem is that the chain, as it gets longer and longer, as the isnad chains, the chains of transmission, extend to more and more people, you have the increasing likelihood that somebody's memory is not going to be as great. You have the famous game of telephone, where in fifth grade, the person in front row whispers something to the next person, and it goes all the way through to the person on the other side of the room in the back row, and it's a completely different thing by the time it gets there. And that's a game, there's no doubt. But people with the best of intentions a policeman will tell you that policemen and lawyers, when people are testifying on the stand, even people with very good memories, with the best of intentions, can get facts wrong or even tell the same story differently a couple of different times. The Hadith contain numerous examples of that kind of legendary elaboration. There is the famous story of Muhammad laughing so hard when one of his soldiers shoots with an arrow one of the Quraysh warriors who's making fun of them.
55 seconds.
Muhammad loves that kind of thing, and he laughs. And this is something that is people, without giving us the context or the details of the story, tell us Muhammad was such a wonderful, human, warm personality, and he laughed heartily at things. And they don't tell them that he was laughing at the suffering and death of this individual. But in any case, in various versions, the Hadith put that story at the Battle of the Trench. Others put it at Uhud. The identity of the Quraysh warrior changes. And these are just small examples of how these things are changed so much that while there may be some historical kernel to them, you cannot know what it is at this vantage point, and thus cannot be sure that any of this is historical at all. Thank you.
Your time is up. Thank you very much, sir. And so that was the opening statement from both sides. We will be moving first 15 minutes of rebuttal. and Mary will start. So again, those of you who are joining us in the chat, it's good to have you. If you've got any questions regarding the debate to the speakers, please tag DCCI Ministries and then tell us who you are asking your question and put your question there. Mary, whenever you are ready, let me know. I'll put your timing up.
All right, I need you to bring up my presentation again, please. Thank you.
Okay, your time starts. 15 minutes for first rebuttal.
All right. Well, Robert brought up many interesting points, as he usually does, and he really gets at the heart of what is at question here whenever he focuses on the gaps that he points to between the material that is currently in wide publication today and its the creation date of that particular form of that material. And he also, again, and notice that I said before that the Muslim or the Mohammed mythicists, they will demand constant documentation from Muhammad's birth to the Abbasid state with details in surviving manuscripts. And Robert, in fact, did this. He emphasized, when the manuscripts come from of particular publications and things like that to invalidate the entire story. But that's not how history is done. You don't look at just one manuscript and say, well, when do we have the most recent surviving manuscript of that and what forms it in? And that's when it was created. This is an example of Alexander the Great, who was a historical figure. And not only do none of the sources between his death survive in the first 300 years, we have no fragments of sources from his lifetime. We also don't have any of the writings after this point until a 9th century Latin source that has a manuscript on it. And then our other manuscripts are from the 10th century and later. When we do history, we look at what are these people relying on? What are their contexts? What are the things that we don't have that survive in detail or in fact on any physical manuscript at all? What are they? We don't just say that if we do not have it in our hand, it does not exist. We look at the context and the content of all of history to evaluate it. And so one thing that he emphasizes, and again, I've noted that it's really important that we do not give the Islamicist narrative space, and instead we look at what the sources actually are. So one thing that he emphasizes is that these people had maybe they had wonderful memories. It's an oral culture. The story is that they had wonderful memories. But when we look at the history, they weren't depending on their memories. This is very important. They were depending on other writing. So here's one example. He mentioned Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq was actually not the first writer of biographical material of Muhammad. He is one of the 2 early writers whose material survives till this day. We have 2 separate testimonies of it that are largely complete, one in Al-Tabari and one in his follower Ibn Hisham. And when we put these 2 together, they match except for some details, which mostly Ibn Hisham thought was embarrassing and he omitted, he got rid of, that still survive in Al-Tabaris. So Al-Tabari had access to Ibn Ishaq, Hisham had access, and they each produced their own that Al-Tabari largely just quoting it, and Hisham trying to deep six things that pointed back to things that he didn't want people to repeat. But when you look at this, one of the major contributors to Ibn Ishaq's story was a man named Azuri. Azuri produced writings. He produced writings that were published in his time. They don't survive intact, but they survive in quotation, not as oral stories, but they are written. Before then, the generation of the children of Muhammad's followers were also well known to make writings. They did not preserve their writings, but rather use them for their own private reviewing and documentation. One of these, Urwa, was even known to collect stories from letters because he didn't travel. He's from Medina. All of these people live in Medina until Azuri moves after his last teacher dies. But he's collecting letters from other people that he knows about, from his parents and the other people in Medina, asking them about their accounts of what happened before they died. And so this activity is a written activity. There's a de-emphasis on this in the later Islamicist accounts. But again, we need to pay attention to what history actually tells us and not the narratives. Similarly, Robert Spencer will say that, oh, well, they weren't bothered by these things because they thought that the books were corrupt. Robert Spencer here is going past the classical scholars and even past the vast majority of the post-classical scholars into things that modern Islamicists had to say when they were confronted with the Islamic sources together with the Jewish and Christian scriptures. Because once they were confronted, they were no longer able to deny these things, when before there were authorities that could say that if you read this, it's illegitimate. If you read this, you will be killed. I can't be killed by an Islamic figure for reading their holy material. And that also accounts for the somewhat confused view that many Christians had of what the holy texts were of the Muslims. Now, Robert also slightly confuses the idea of a codex or a manuscript with the idea of a book or a writing. So whenever you have a physical copy of the Quran, that's a manuscript, a codex, something of that sort. Books are smaller, self-standing portions that may be inside a codex and may be inside a different codex, may be written separately, may be existing in different forms, but the codex of the Quran, we don't actually have any doubt as to when it exists. We know that it existed by 669. And in fact, it is the Sinan manuscript that he is referring to, in which one test on it came back as between, let's see when it was, between 578 or 570-ish and 645. And that was one folio done by one testing location. But he has said that if it could be earlier than Mohammed, then we have to throw it out. But that's not how testing works. If you look here, this is the most recent and considered best done carbon dating of this Sinan manuscript. And it reduced, so whenever you do a dating, you produce dates with different levels of probability. And the probability of 95% is between 578 and 669. Well, is that different than what you would expect if you were expecting it to be written in the range of 634 to 640, which is what we would actually expect with the contents? No. In fact, these dates center on a date of 632 as the most probable date of when the animals were killed that eventually produced this and was shipped down and probably written into a codex a few years later, 1, 2, 3, 4 years later. It's the correct date. It's the correct date for the type of text it is. And he has the idea that maybe if we have 20% of the Quran, we can't know it's a Quran. That would be like saying, well, I found this stack of documents that were bound into a book, and of what we have, the portions that survive, we have 20% of the New Testament. And some of the books are in different orders, but that means that we can't know it's the New Testament. We can have no confidence in it's a New Testament, even though it's verse for verse the New Testament and the parts that survive. And the fact that it's in a different order, that shows that it's not the New Testament. That's not how we do history. That's not how we evaluate manuscripts. This is not a proto-Quran. This is the Quran with the surahs, which would classically be considered books within a codex, not really chapters within a linked narrative, therefore inside of a book. A distinct unit would be called a book by anyone from a Western background. So what we have is the Quran. Not only that, but it's in the correct place. It's in the correct script. It has the kinds of things that we expect it to have, and it even has the types of variants that we would expect it to have. Now, one other point that he relies on very heavily is the coins. and the coins are important. But it is untrue that before a late date, before the 7th or the 8th century, there were no coins with Muhammad's name on it. In fact, there were. This one is an early coin that is the kind of prototypical Islamic form, and it's identified as Uthmanic because of the form of the script on it. Not by me, by experts in coinage. And it says Muhammad is a messenger of Allah on it. Now, why was this not the normal form of coinage? Well, actually, we have Christian testimony that says that these Muslims do not dare to change our coins because we won't use them if they do. And when the coins were finally changed, we have documentation that there were riots about it. So we have first a statement, they don't dare to change it. They want to, they won't. And then we have a confirmation that there were riots about it, and that the Muslims didn't make the change until they were secure. Furthermore, we see the same pattern in the Zoroastrian period. They would have pictures of a guy that they had deposed were chasing across Central Asia, trying to kill, together with his religious Zoroastrian symbols on the back. They weren't pro-Zoroastrian because they had the old coins. They weren't pro-Christian because they had the old coins. They were doing it for practical reasons until they had the ability to do otherwise. I would like to read very briefly at this time when supposedly they weren't enemies of the cross, from even before this time, from Saint Sophronius, who was actively being besieged by the Muslims at this time. And he says, why have the churches been pulled down? Why is the cross mocked? Robert says the cross is not mocked because it's on the coins. The Christians at that time, living in their own words, say that it was, that they mocked the cross. Moreover, they raised up more and more against us, increased their blasphemy of Christ in the church, and utter wicked blasphemies against God. And one of the earliest Islamic inscriptions, which dates from about 650, does have the Surah al-Ikhlas on it, denying the entirety of the divine nature that God has a son. So we have them hating the cross, denying the son. These are in the sources. And it's very important to look at not just the Roman coins, but other coins. We have to have the full context. We have to have the full story, not a partial story. And I know that he brought up a lot of things, and his debate won't have time to get to them all. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is the narrative of the different accounts with different versions of the story of the event where one of Muhammad's followers shot someone, he fell over, and his genitals were exposed, right? This is precisely the kinds of different things that we expect from eyewitness accounts, most especially from secondhand eyewitness accounts. In one of them, we have the details of the fact that it was Muhammad's own nurse whom he loved who had been humiliated shortly before this event, which gets kind of hidden from the other ones. Like, what's the context? Why is he so excited about this guy getting shot and his genitals are exposed? Why is he so amused by this? Well, it's because this guy had just embarrassed Muhammad's own nurse. That part's dropped out from some. If you're doing lots of fighting, you'll forget which particular place it was. If you're telling stories about a bunch of your friends, and especially, you tell your kids these stories, your kids might not remember whether or not it was at battle A or battle B that you told them this story. And again, these stories became written very early. In fact, we have textual variants in the ahadith that prove that they are transmitted in a written form. But in that small intervening space, along with the fallible memory of humans and the difference in eyewitness accounts, we will have details like that are variant. And it's important to notice that if you spoke to law enforcement officers, if you speak to judges, lawyers, how do you know if eyewitness accounts are true? Well, if they have different details, if they have small discrepancies, they're much more likely to be true accounts from the point of view of the people who spoke them than they are if they're not. And I would like to bring up again that he brought up Qutham. and the name of Mohammed. And I brought this up at the beginning as an example of something that points to a real Mohammed, because they had to account for the fact that Mohammed was denied a name that was a family name and given a foreigner's name. That's the context of all the accounts. It's, oh, because he's special. No, it's because his grandfather thought he was a bastard. But you need to explain it. Why? Because he was a real person. Thank you very much, Robert.
Your time is up. Thank you very much, Mary. If you can mute yourself, I'll remove your slides, and then I'll put Robert Spencer. If you can unmute yourself, please. Your 15, if you can unmute yourself, Robert. Okay.
There we go.
Yeah. Your 15 minutes start now for the rebuttal.
Okay. The thing about the difference between Alexander and Muhammad is not just a matter of ignoring the prerequisites of historiography, because actually Alexander is referred to many times by many people before the writings are preserved. And so it was very clear from the contemporary record and from the record of the immediate aftermath of his life that there was an Alexander and that he did various things. And so the idea that we would be saying that Alexander didn't exist because his writings only show up a few hundred years later is a fundamental misunderstanding of the whole position. Because what we have in the case of Muhammad, you mentioned Saint Sophronius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, at the time of the Arab conquest. This indicates a very different situation. This is in the late 630s, and the Arabs have overwhelmed the Christians, the Roman Christians, and conquered Jerusalem. Sophronius is the de facto ruler of the area because the Roman Empire really was too weak at that time, after a number of exhausting wars with Persia, to exert its authority over the area. And Sophronius is very preoccupied with the conquest. And as you noted, he refers to their reviling the cross and destroying churches and so on. I found it odd, though, that you would adduce that in connection with the coins, because I didn't make up that they minted coins with a cross on them. They did that. And so that has to coexist with the reality of the fact that Sophronius said they reviled the cross, and that nonetheless they published coins, they minted coins rather, that had the cross on them. These things both are facts, and so we have to find an explanation that accounts for both. And the explanation is actually this. Sophronius, interestingly enough, in voluminous writings about the theological meaning of the conquest, about how God could have abandoned his people or appeared to have done so, or is he punishing the Christians for their sins, or Sophronius is casting about for an explanation, and he's anguished by this conquest. And in all his discussions of the Arabs and the depredations that they have brought to the area, he never mentions Muhammad, the Quran, or Islam. Now that is extraordinary. It's not an ordinary argument from silence, because Sophronius is actually dealing with the problem presented by the conquest of the Arabs themselves. And so you gotta wonder that why is it that not only Sophronius, but also everybody else who encounters these people as they sweep across half of the known world at the time and conquer everywhere, nobody ever says, hey, these people call themselves Muslims. This word never appears. And there are a few scattered mentions of Mahmet, but nothing giving us any hint of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. And no mention, if the Quran really is the Sana manuscript and dates from 669, it's also exceedingly strange that not only does nobody quote it, but nobody even refers to its existence until decades after that. And so you got to wonder, why is it, if they had this book, did they not care to refer to it if it was so important to them? Now, that is one thing. And it's also important, worth noting, that there's a legendary story that Muslims like to repeat to this day, or they used to like to repeat when they were in tolerance mode in the early part of the 21st century, about how Sophronius showed Umar around Jerusalem and invited him to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And Umar refused magnanimously because he said, if I pray there, my followers will take it for a mosque and I'm going to leave it for you Christians. And in the actual writings of Sophronius, he doesn't mention Umar either, doesn't give any indication that any of that actually happened. As for Ibn Ishaq, you're absolutely right. There are numerous biographers of Muhammad from before Ibn Ishaq. And it's interesting to note that according to the renowned contemporary ex-Muslim Islamic scholar Ibn Warraq, he says the lost original of Ibn Ishaq's work has to be restored or recovered from at least 15 different versions. And that excludes the version of Ibn Hisham. Now, that's not a problem in itself, but the Russian Islamic scholar Alexander Kudelin says that there are considerable differences between the various texts of Ibn Hisham. And we even find this from Ibn Kathir, the great commentator on the Quran from the Middle Ages, from the 15th century. He tells a story, and he actually attributes it to Ibn Hisham. And he says, when Al-Asha was in Mecca or near thereto, some Quraysh polytheists stopped him and asked what business he had there. He told them he'd come seeking the messenger of Allah. One of the Quraysh commented, but Abu Basr, he is forbidding sex. Al-Asha responded, I swear that's no desire of mine, but he's also forbidding wine. The man objected, well, that's something I do hold dear. I'll go off and have my fill of it for a year. Then I'll come back and accept Islam. But he died the same year without returning to the messenger of Allah. And Ibn Kathir then says, thus does Ibn Hisham tell this story here. He extracts a great deal from Muhammad ibn Ishaq, and this is one thing added to his account by Ibn Hisham. Yet in the magisterial edition of Ibn Ishaq ibn Hisham that Guillaume gives us in 1955, that story doesn't appear, which indicates that it doesn't appear in any of the many manuscripts of Ibn Ishaq and that is Ibn Hisham and the rest that Guillaume himself examined. And thus the point is that there was a great deal of slippage and variation, not only in the Quran, but in the literature regarding Ibn Hisham, the literature regarding Muhammad. Now, as for the coins, I did not say that Muhammad was not mentioned on a coin until the 8th century. Actually, I said just the opposite, that the coin in question that is noteworthy is the one from the time of Umar or Uthman that has the word Muhammad plus a cross. And so whatever the Christians may have been complaining about when the Arabs took Jerusalem, or that's recorded by Sophronius, it was something that some years later, either the Muslims were of a different point of view or wanting to demonstrate some conciliation or something of that kind. I think that one's unlikely, actually, as I said before. They didn't ordinarily do that sort of thing. They were usually very harsh with those whom they had conquered. But the point being that with a cross on the coin, you got a big problem, because a cross on the coin is an indication that either the people who minted the coin have no concern for the teachings about the cross that purportedly come from Muhammad, or they are not aware of them. And it seems much more likely that Umar and Uthman, both devoted Sahaba who spent years following Muhammad, would have been very important, very intent on reflecting his teaching in their activities and not transgressing against them. and consequently, the cross that says the coin that says Muhammad with the cross is an indication that most likely the teachings about the cross did not yet exist. As far as the story of the arrow goes, I have the different versions here. Oh, I have the different versions here. And we have in one of them, it's Amir ibn Sa'ad reported on the authority of his father that Allah's apostle gathered for him on the day of Uhud. In another one, we have Amr ibn Sa'ad, okay, same guy. Sa'ad said, I had seen the Prophet laugh at the Battle of the Trench. Now, you can say that, oh, maybe they just didn't remember which battle this happened in, but there are also important differences in the story itself. In the first version, we have Day of Uhud, the Allah's apostle gathered for him on the day of Uhud, his parents, when a polytheist set fire to the Muslims. That is, they attacked them very fiercely. Thereupon, Allah's apostle said, Sa'ad, shoot an arrow. Sa'ad, shoot an arrow, Sa'ad, may my mother and father be taken as ransom for you. I drew an arrow, and I shot a featherless arrow at him, aiming at his side. Then he fell down, and his private parts were exposed. Allah's messenger laughed, then I saw his front teeth. In the next version, we have Battle of the Trench, and I said, how was his laughter? He said, there was a man holding a shield while Sa'ad was shooting, and the man was saying such and such and such and such, with the shield covering his forehead. Sa'ad therefore aimed an arrow at him and shot it when he raised his head. So it did not miss this part of him, meaning his forehead, and the man toppled over and kicked up his foot. The Prophet then laughed so much that his molar teeth became apparent. I asked, what made him laugh? He replied, what he did to the man. And so you have very different circumstances for when the arrow was shot. In one, the guy is just attacking the Muslims very fiercely. In the other, the victim is holding a shield in front of him and making fun of the Muslims. It's also worth noting that another story that has to do with Muhammad's tensions with the Banu Kainuka, the Jewish tribe, one of the Jewish tribes in Medina, has a very similar story about the Jews and how they pinned up the skirt of a Muslim woman so that when she stood up, her genitals were exposed. And Muhammad's not around in that one, and he's not laughing. The Jews are all laughing. And then Muhammad decides that this is a very wicked people that need to be punished. And so there seems to be a preoccupation with stories about the exposure of genitals, and it's funny how these kinds of things just keep happening in the life of Muhammad. Or maybe these are all legendary variations on a single theme. And in any case, it's impossible to know what exactly the truth of the matter is. There's no way to tell from the vantage point of the mass of written material that suddenly appears in the 9th century what actually happened. And if we can't be aware of what actually happened on stories that are relatively unimportant like that, it also must be borne in mind that the same principle applies to the whole story altogether. That the lateness of the sources and the variance within them indicate that we cannot know what the kernel of truth is that may have given rise to any of this. And there was, oh goodness, there's another thing here about this. Anyway, I'll have to stop there because I can't remember the next thing I was going to say. That's the wonders of getting old, but maybe it'll come back to me.
Thank you very much, Robert Spencer. You still had just over a minute. So, Mary, are you ready for your second rebuttal of 15 minutes?
I am, if you can bring up my slides.
Yeah, so these rebuttals are 3 rounds. So this is our second round, starts now. Mary, you are ready to go.
All right. So one thing that Robert said is that, Alexander was referred to in the interim period of time. And then he said that Muhammad wasn't except for when he was. So here are the earliest non-Muslim references to the event of the conquest and descriptions of it, anything related to that. We have Muhammad mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. Now, one of them, Robert does like to point out, has a slightly variant spelling, but that shows again that people were not familiar with this name. It was a weird name for them, and so they took a version of it according to their own phonetic rules and what they happened to hear. And so it wasn't a native name to them. They didn't recognize it. These people are all testimony of the Arab conquest. They have different details depending on where they lived, depending on how much they knew firsthand and how much they were reporting through the telephone game, as Robert would like to say. Because, you know, the people who are all the way out in France and Kazakhstan, they are not firsthand witnesses to this. But some of these people are. And they all show the concerns that all of these people had. Many of them, and we can't look at any of these in isolation, we look at them together. And what we see is that they mention the Arabs. They mention that they're warmongers. They mention Muhammad. They mention that they're monotheistic. A few of them mention that they're Abrahamic. They also often mention that they are anti-Christian, against Christ in their theology. Now, Robert referred to the voluminous accounts of St. Sophronius. Actually, what we have are 2 of the homilies in his collection where he's dealing with very specific events. One of them was in 634. The other one was either in 636 or 637 that he delivered these as homilies. Each person who writes is writing for a specific audience to record a specific thing according to their particular interests. None of these people had interest in expanding upon the theology of this group. As for, playing on the exact word fallacy, asking for the term Muslim and Islam and Quran, the issues are that I agree they did not call themselves this very often then. They aren't called this very often in the Quran itself. They are only called this sometimes in the Quran. They're mostly called the believers. And these folks aren't going to call them, oh, they're the believers. No, they're going to call them something else. The other thing they called themselves were immigrants. Later, laws were passed down that gave immigrants special status. And they said, no, you can't count as an immigrant unless you immigrated from Mecca to Medina. But for a long time, anyone who moved from one place to another on the account of Islam was included in the immigrant title. So they would call them this very often, this immigrant word. He wishes to say that we have to account for the crosses, that the crosses speak of their support and endorsement of Christianity, or at least the cross. We have, that is conjecture and interpretation when we have specific words of people living then saying that they mock the cross, that they are against it. Some of them call them unbelievers. Some of them call them the people of the beast, specifically in reference to their desire to build Al-Aqsa Mosque. So these are very important. If we account for the cross, we cannot account for it in any way that is different than we are accounting for these Zoroastrian symbols. So if Robert Spencer wants to argue that they are not opposed to Christianity, then they must be equally friendly to Zoroastrianism based on the Zoroastrian symbols. The issue is that we have no evidence of this. And we have, again, firsthand testimony saying, why are there crosses here? If they're against the cross, why are there crosses? They don't dare to change it. We won't accept their money. We don't have Persian sources saying that about the Zoroastrian. We do have to fill that in, but we have different Christian sources saying that it is proof of Christianity that even though they are against us, they still have to put our cross on the coins. They talk about it. They care about it. And when they took it off, they rebelled. There were riots in the street. There was great unrest. They only did it when they had confidence that they could. As for quotations, Muhammad is the messenger of Allah is a quotation from the Quran that is inscribed on something. We also have one from 360 outside of the physical manuscripts that we have. These physical manuscripts that we have that are numerous, not just one. There are many manuscripts, and we have to look at the 85% probability of the range in which they exist. We can't say that because it is in this range, it must be a specific date. We have to look at the range and say that we must accept dates within this range, a date within this range, not all dates within this range. That's another flaw of an approach whenever we do this. Now, again, I'm glad that Robert returned to the story of the exposure of the man at a battle with more detail, because one of his statements often is that legends should match, true stories should match and legends won't. So his proposal is that someone made up a story about shooting someone at a battle, or maybe someone shot about someone at a battle somewhere, and then many different versions of this were formed and floated around before some were written. But again, if you ask law enforcement, what is the evidence of a lie? It's that everyone's telling the same story, that everyone who's recorded, they're all telling the same story. Whereas if it's truth, it is the same narrative, but with different details. There's nothing that conflicts in the story of a guy getting shot, his genitals being exposed, and Mohammed laughing, except for the location, which again, if you're fighting in many battles because your leader is a warlord, not you necessarily, probably not you, but one of your followers, one of the people that you've been telling stories to around the campfire forgets which place that you put it in. Now, we actually do know that happened in Hud because of the presence of Ayman, which was the triggering event. And of all the accounts of Mohammed, this is one of the more certain ones because of all these details that line up well, and where discrepancies emerge, we can see why. You drop the detail of Ayman, so you're like, well, it happened at a battle, it happened at a famous battle, maybe it's the Battle of the Trench. So these do work together to form an authentic testimony, as authentic as any other history that we have. Now, he does point to this loosiness and goosiness that you do get in the sources when you go back to Muhammad's earliest days, before he had many followers to remember things, but also, I would posit, before he had solidified his own claims. When we look at people and their careers as self-described prophets, like Joseph Smith, for instance, the things that they will teach about themselves will evolve over time. And if you're accepting the later ones, then the early ones become problematic. We have Muhammad emerge with a clear theology that stops changing shortly after the Hijrah. When you look at the Quran itself, the Quran internally teaches variant theologies very clearly when you organize it in a manner according to when it was most probably revealed. And that is a normal evolution of a religious leader of the same class that Muhammad was in, the same class as Joseph Smith. And that again points to the reality of himself and his background as an individual. Now, it's interesting because it's interesting because Robert has granted that maybe there was a prophet with a mole, but why would you use that mole prophet and promote it? Why would you choose him and promote it? So if you have chosen one of these, if you have all of these legends and you are in the position to codify things, but again, we know already that there was no such position because we know when the Quran was set in form. Why would you codify it in this way? Why would you choose this? Why would you have to say, if people check out these claims, we will kill them, rather than have something that has some rhetorical power, that's a good twisting of scripture, that has something that can back it up when you look at things in a certain way. Like the Jehovah's Witnesses do a much better job with their claims than Muhammad does when you have the scriptures that the claims are being made about. And this is accounted for by the fact that Muhammad didn't have access to these. His immediate followers didn't have access to these. And when they did, they didn't say, well, these were corrupted, because they didn't believe that they were. Muhammad didn't teach they were. Generations believed that they were intact and they were in perfect agreement. When they weren't, they just went, well, they could corrupt an individual thing and you might be led astray, but the real ones still support Muhammad. That is what is said clearly over and over again by various people who are trying to account for this. Well, they lied to you. Well, they just forged that one for you. And don't look into it or you're outside of Islam. Don't let them read our stuff or they will be killed. It's very important that they had to do this rather than coming up with something that does have a persuasive rhetorical story behind it. Now, finally, Robert does point to the Ibn Ishaq surviving in 15 different versions. The issue is that they are very heavily in agreement, the same as we have textual versions of Herodotus, textual versions of this, textual versions of that. They are very heavily in agreement. Where they disagree mostly is the lacunae, which is important because things were deleted out of these accounts that were embarrassing, and they survive in some and get removed from others. And it's the places where things are removed that are actually the most interesting and the most telling. You find out that Muhammad's grandfather is doing a ritual of a paternity ritual in front of the statue of Hubal, only from one of those deleted lines that Al-Tabari didn't think about, didn't realize what its intention was, or didn't see the problem with, and went ahead and wrote. Ibn Hisham went, oh my goodness, we need to take this out, and deleted it. So the things that are erased are also important when they survive. Do I say we have everything? No. Do I say our sources are better than any other source that ever existed? No. But they are real sources that do need accounting for. They're not perfect. No sources are perfect. People had motives. People had desires. But they're real people existing in a real time. And as a final kind of important point, and I would have liked to have turned this into something that's really more condensed, but it's really hard because there's so much information. The earliest sirah that was exhaustively done and published was actually published by someone who died in about 729. Fragments of this do survive, like physical fragments from the 8th century do survive. We have early tafsir that are compiled and surviving. We also have fragments of people from as early as the 7th century, very small physical fragments of writings that are otherwise lost do survive. And people talk about these writings. They contain about the same things as the fragments do. So this points to the reliability. A large body of theological debate over the sources, the same sources that we have now, had emerged in very early Islam. They emerged by the second fitna in 685. People are already having fights over meanings. And a lot of this is not political. A good portion of it is, because Islam was always political, but large portions aren't political. Like, what's Allah? Does he have features? Does he have a body? Does he have attributes at all? Does he not have attributes? Is the Quran created? These are all very early debates. And yes, the flowering of these debates are later, but they're rooted in actual real early historical things. And the mythicists rely on this supposed unknown gap where anything could have happened to allow there anything to happen, of which they have no evidence, no documentation. They can bring forward no positive case, no evidence of what they're saying, no evidence of this construct. They can't bring before us these other historical figures that were combined together. They cannot bring us the physical copies of any text that was incorporated in the Quran. What we have is Quran, not something that was then changed substantially into Quran. They can't bring us any of the things that we can bring them, much less the kinds of evidence that they demand for their own case. And again, the reason I'm so passionate about this is because it obscures what Islam really taught. It obscures who Muhammad really is, and he speaks clearly in the sources, and we need to hold Islam accountable for the actual contents of their sources that were transmitted with ordinary sorts of historical reliability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. You had still a few seconds. Robert Spencer, if you can unmute yourself. Thank you. Your Second rebuttal of 15 minutes starts now, sir.
Thank you. In the first place, no evidence for any of this construct. On the contrary, for example, you have a story in Islamic tradition where you have an old man saying, "We never read the Quran in the mosques until the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf." Why would they not read the Quran in mosques when they had it, supposedly, for 50 years before Hajjaj ibn Yusuf? Why is it that the worship centered around other things, and only at the time of Hajjaj, at the end of the 7th century and beginning of the 8th, do you have Quran? Also, you have evidence from the people I quoted before, the two Christians, the anonymous one and St. John of Damascus, both of whom give an indication that they're not making a point of it, but in the course of the nature of their discussion, they make it clear that they are not aware of the Quran as a single book as we have it now. They clearly make reference to at least two books, because the anonymous guy says the Quran and Surah al-Baqarah, and John refers to several chapters of the Quran and one unknown writing that have to do with that are what he purports to be the ridiculous books of Muhammad. And he doesn't give any indication that they are one book. There are numerous strands of evidence of this kind that the standard story just doesn't explain. And we still don't have any satisfactory explanation for the cross on the coins. To say that the Muslims didn't like the cross, or the Arabs, I should say, didn't like the cross before the time of the coinage, doesn't change the fact that the coins were made. And if the standard story is true, then the coins were minted at the time, within the lifetime of numerous people who had to have heard and had to have been familiar with Muhammad saying that Jesus will come back and break the cross, and that Jesus was not killed or crucified. And consequently, the idea that they would have done this doesn't make any sense for the persistence of this idea. The Zoroastrian thing does not have the same, is not in the same category, precisely because you don't have that kind of direct attack on the Zoroastrian theology as you have on the Christian theology of the cross. And so if they have these teachings of Muhammad and the Quran ringing in their ears, and yet they put crosses on the coins, it's extraordinarily strange and as yet unexplained. And as for Sophronius, we actually do have more than those two writings that you referred to, but it is precisely the theology of these of this incident that he's interested in. He is trying to understand how it is that God could have allowed this. And so the theology of the invaders would have been of particular interest to him, because the Muslims, of course, according to the standard narrative, consider the conquests of jihadis to be an indication of the superiority and the victory of Islam. And so if these people who conquered Jerusalem thought that, then that would have been something that Sophronius would have found of tremendous interest, and would have indicated that in his writings. And you're right, there are a few mentions of Muhammad or Mahmet in the 7th century. And what's noteworthy about them is that not a single one of them, zero, none, contain any details about Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. Every last one of them says something about him that he doesn't actually do, according to Islamic tradition. And so you got to wonder, are they talking about the same guy? Or are they talking about somebody else altogether? It could be that some of these people that they are referring to had their stories folded into the Muhammad myth, but it cannot be taken as a slam dunk that these various references are referring to the Muhammad of Islam, when none of them correspond to the Muhammad of Islam. For example, the Doctrina Jacobi from the 630s, right after Muhammad is supposed to have died, and he says, he's got this dialogue he's talking about, what can you tell me about the prophet who appeared with the Saracens? He replied, he is false, for the prophets do not come armed with a sword. Okay, so far so good. That's why people think it's Muhammad, who he doesn't name, by the way. This prophet doesn't name. But he also has him saying that he is preaching the advent of the anointed one, the Christ who is to come. Now, that is not a part of Muhammad's teaching in any significant way in Islamic tradition. He has the hadiths about the return of Jesus, but to get the idea that this is the central aspect of his message, the only one that merits mention, well, you got to wonder, are they talking about the same guy? Then you have, where is he? Thomas the Presbyter, who refers to a battle between the Romans and the Tayyeye de Mahmet in 634. And the Tayyeye are nomads, the word means. And the thing about Mahmet is that Syriac, in which this is written, it does distinguish between a T and a D. So maybe this is the guy, and maybe it isn't. But here again, we have no details whatsoever about who he is or what he's all about. And so we cannot assume that this is even the same person, since the name isn't even the same. Then you have various others. John I, the Patriarch of Antioch, in 639, has a discussion with Amr ibn al-As, the conqueror of Egypt. Now, you would think that when he's talking to the conqueror of Egypt, that he would get some explanation as to who these people are and what they're about. And yet here again, you have the reference is to the Hagarians, the descendants of Hagar, the concubine of Abraham. No one in either side of the discussion makes any reference to the Quran, Islam, and Muhammad. What's noteworthy about this is that we only have it in a manuscript that survives from the year 874. So even if we assume that it comes from the 7th century, it could have been heavily altered. And yet even then, it has no mention whatsoever of Muhammad, Islam, or the Quran. And that's exactly the place where you would expect it, where you have a Christian leader and he's asking a putatively Muslim leader, what on earth are you people about? What are you doing? Why have you come? Why are you laying waste to our lands and conquering us? And it never comes up. It is never think to mention Muhammad or Islam. In the same way, the Patriarch of Seleucia, Isso Yahab III, wrote in the year 647 about the Tayyeye and the Arab Hagarians, who do not help those who attribute sufferings and death to God, the Lord of everything. And so he's saying that the Tayyeye reject the crucifixion and divinity of Christ, and the Quran does. So maybe that's something that they have in common. But once again, Ishu Yahab says nothing at all about Muslims, Islam, the Quran, Muhammad, nothing. And so you can go on and on and on. That in Sebe, here's one for you. In the 660s or 670s, there's an Armenian bishop, Sebeos, and he writes this: there was an Ishmaelite called Mahmet, a merchant. He presented himself to them as though at God's command. Okay, here's your guy, right? As a preacher, as the way of truth, and taught them to know the God of Abraham, for he was very well informed, very well acquainted with the story of Moses. As the command came from on high, they all united under the authority of a single man, under a single law, and abandoning vain cults, returned to the living God, who had revealed himself to their father Abraham. So here we seem to have indisputable historical attestation of his existence. However, even Sebeos presents a picture of Muhammad that sharply differs from the canonical Islamic narrative. He says, Mohammed forbade them to eat the flesh of any dead animal, to drink wine, that much he got right, to lie, they do that a lot, or to fornicate. He added, God has promised this land to Abraham and his posterity after him forever. He acted according to his promise while he loved Israel. Now you are the sons of Abraham, and God fulfills in you the promise made to Abraham and his posterity. Now, the Quran does have Moses telling the children of Israel, O my people, go into the Holy Land that Allah has ordained for you. The Quran also depicts Allah saying, we caused the people who were despised to inherit the eastern parts of the land and the western parts, which we had blessed. This also is stated in the context of Moses and its exodus from Egypt. But in Sebeos's quote of Muhammad, it's on God's promise to Abraham. Now, Mohammed is, as depicted by Sebeos, in other words, is a spokesman for the God of Abraham and expressing love for Israel. While in the Quran, although we have these passages, there is also tremendous hostility toward the children of Israel and a lot of anger and abuse that is heaped upon them. So it may be that the Mohammed of Sebeos, who is so favorable to Israel, represents an earlier stage in the development of the religion that became Islam, but it's very clear that it's not Islam itself, as it should have been fully formed from the year 632. And anyway, as Sebeos goes on, it becomes even more divergent from the Muhammad of Islamic tradition. He says, then they all gathered together from Havilah unto Shur and before Egypt. They came out of the desert of Faran, divided into 12 tribes, according to the lineages of their patriarchs. You ever heard of the Muslims marching out in 12 tribes? They divided among their tribes the 12,000 Israelites. You ever heard of Israelites marching with the Muslims? 1,000 per tribe to guide them into the land of Israel. They set out camp by camp in the order of their patriarchs, and he names all the patriarchs from Genesis. Have you ever heard of that in the Quran? Nope. These are the tribes of Ishmael. All that remained of the peoples of the children of Israel came to join them, and they constituted a mighty army. They sent an embassy to the emperor of the Greeks, saying, Allah has given this land as a heritage to our father Abraham and his posterity after him. Have you ever heard of the appeal to the Roman emperor being based on Allah's promise to Abraham? No, this is a very different thing. There is no trace in Islamic tradition of Muhammad leading the 12 tribes of Israel into their ancestral homeland, nor is there the slightest hint that he was ever the leader of the 12 tribes of Israel at all, or that any army of Jews ever aided the Muslims in conquering Egypt or anywhere else. And so there is in 9th century Islamic tradition the idea that Muhammad wrote a letter to Heraclius, the Roman emperor, or the emperor of the Greeks, as many called him. But in the Islamic version, as you would expect, he's calling upon him to accept Islam. He doesn't say anything about the children of Israel and the promises to Abraham. And so you have a vastly different religious environment that Sebeos is attributing to Muhammad. And so to just facilely list these as early mentions of Muhammad and confirmation of his historicity leaves enormous questions. Were the Arabs who were around the time of Sebeos talking about Judaism and the tribes of Israel and the promises to Abraham?
1 minute, sir.
And or were they? Was this something that was attributed to them later on? In any case, it's not the Muhammad of Islam. When we come to the stories of Muhammad of Islam, we know so much. We have so much detail. There's such a tremendous proliferation of information. You would think that if any of that had any correspondence to any historical reality, then it would show up somewhere in the 9th century traditions, but it doesn't. Another thing that doesn't are the leap months. In chapter 9 of the Quran, Muhammad forbids the leap month that was in the Arab calendar. And yet, in all of Islamic tradition, he's never attributed to be doing something in the leap months that existed until Surah 9 toward the end of his career. So did he take a month off every few years? Very suspicious.
Thank you very much, sir. And now we will be doing last round of rebuttal of 15 minutes. And those of you who are joining us in the chat, it's good to have you there. If you have questions, please tag DCCI Ministries and then tell me who you are asking your question to. I will bring that up after very shortly. Actually, we've got 30 minutes left of altogether rebuttal, 15 minutes Mary and 15 minutes Robert Spencer. Then we've got 5 minutes of closing statements. After that, I will be bringing up your questions. So please tag DCCI Ministries and then tell me who you are addressing your questions to. And Mary, do you want your PowerPoints up? Okay. So your 15 minutes of last rebuttal starts now.
All right. I want to start with Robert's quotation of someone saying we never read the Quran in the mosques. That's not what the source says. First, let's begin with what I'm asking of him is to provide the kind of sources that he says we need to trust something. And he is providing a post-classical source that says that we never read the Mus'haf. We never read from a physical book in the Qurans until the time of Ibn Hajjaj, right? So it's not saying that we didn't recite the Quran, that we were doing something else in the mosques. It was saying that the practice of physically reading from a book was introduced then. Now, if you go to a mosque today, very often they do not read from a physical book. They pride themselves on reciting from memory. So this does indicate that there was a push toward people making sure that they were doing things accurately rather than from memory, because somebody wasn't happy that people might have been doing things from memory. May have been one mosque, may have been many mosques, we don't know. Somewhere there was a push to not recite from memory, but rather read from a physical object. And this confusion between a physical object and the abstraction of the Quran as a whole kind of continues in his arguments. He's arguing from St. John of Damascus, talking about books. Again, for him, a codex, like this is a codex, not so much a book. The Bible is a codex, and it contains within it books. Each one of the surat to anyone in the ancient world would be considered a book. As for the uncertainty of their names, they did not receive standard names until quite recent. I mean, even recently, like you'll find in the 20th century, people referring to different surat by multiple names. So yes, they do. So asking whether or not they're referring to a specific codex and naming it the Quran, again, it's ahistorical anyway, because the Quran does not call itself as a whole thing a Quran, and it took a long time for them to develop this terminology, just as you don't find in early Christian writings references to the Bible as a codex, because it took a while for people to speak of it in that way. Now, again, he's denying the firsthand commentary and explanation that the Christians are giving for the coins. They tell us why the coins weren't changed. They say these guys don't dare to do it. And Robert says, no, it means that they must support the cross. Sophronia says they hate the cross. Robert says, no, they like the cross. He appeals to John, Bishop of Nikiu in Egypt, who calls them the enemies of God and who had the detestable doctrine of the beast, who is Mohammed, and then is unhappy that he doesn't like explain in detail what these issues are. To have issues with it doesn't mean that you have to explain exactly what your issues are. And again, we need to look at what the Quran itself explains and talks about, and what the early sources say, and what we should expect from this early age based on the sources that we have. Robert has now gone to the Hegarian thesis, but he himself translates this as immigrants many times in his book, and he admits that this is the way in which the Arabic word for immigrant is rendered in the languages, the other various languages. It means an immigrant. And again, as I have explained, immigrants got special privileges and titles, and that was stripped away in historical times from anyone who had not gone from Mecca to Medina, because there were too many people who had traveled everywhere and were all demanding to have the extra credits of immigrants. So yes, they did describe themselves as immigrant or Hagarian, but it has nothing to do with their background. It's not Hagarian. Hagar has the same root as the word for immigrant. This is a coincidence. It has nothing to do with their actual origins. And again, he goes to things that actually do describe a historical Muhammad in the context of his time as understood, as his claims were understood by people from far away. Pseudo-Sebios, we don't know who necessarily it was, but it was someone out in Armenia, distant from this. And this person contextualizes Muhammad's claims as having the same religion as the Christians and Jews. I want to be very clear. Muhammad didn't say, I'm coming to you with a new religion. The Quran never says, I'm coming to you with a new religion. I'm coming to you with nothing new. I'm coming to you with the exact same scriptures there were. I'm representing the same things. I am the same person. I have the authentic same religion. I have the religion of the Christians. I have the religion of the Jews. You guys who are doing other things, you're just deviants. That's what the sources are actually claiming. And so whenever you view it in that point, yeah, he didn't have a big troop of Jews who came with him. Nobody who was close to the event said that he did. But did he have people who were marching in tribes? Yes. Did he claim to be the one promised to the Jews? Yes. One source that I find really fascinating is the Doctrina Jacobi. And this one is important because it does say things that are in the Islamic sources that were an emphasis then early on, but became de-emphasized, like the keys of paradise. In fact, the Quran goes to the lengths of borrowing the word for keys instead of using the native Arabic word for keys and ascribing this as something that Allah has to be able to give to someone. Did Muhammad run around saying that the Messiah is about to come at any moment? He absolutely did. He was an apocalyptic prophet. I am the last prophet. Every other kingdom, every other land in the place, every other city, it's had its prophets. Now it's my turn. I'm the last one. It's the end of days. Everything's about to end. I'm it. The Messiah will come back. Now, did this Jew, again, this is telephone game. This is somebody coming to a location that's many hundreds of miles away from the action and hearing rumors that have spread through the Jewish community as he arrives at Caesarea. Like he's up at Caesarea, he's hearing rumors. He's proclaiming the coming of the Messiah. The Jews are going, oh, he's the one who he's promising that he's coming before our Messiah comes. But what is he actually doing? The guy that he calls the Messiah is Jesus, who's supposed to return. They don't have all the information. That's the kind of thing that we expect from historical sources that they are. So, and again, if the coin is evidence of pro-Christian status because it has on it a cross, the most holy symbol of the Zoroastrians would show a pro-Zoroastrian symbol, would show a pro-Zoroastrian inclination. If putting a cross says that you are pro-Christian, putting the most holy symbol of the Zoroastrians shows that you're pro-Zoroastrian. The idea that, like, oh, well, they would be fine with it because they're not explicitly anti-Zoroastrian. They were breaking the crosses at the time of Sophronius. That's why it was the churches being pulled down and the cross mocked together. When they were pulling down the churches, what would they do with the crosses? They were against. So we have to go with what the people testify over what we suppose that this should mean to us. And again, this is about treating the materials that we have seriously and demanding the same level of evidence for the pro position or for an alternative position that you're trying to level against the normative historical methodology. This is not anything like the way that I am reading history is not anything unusual. It's not anything strange. It's not anything that is privileging the sources of Islam. Both the kind of confusion and the kind of specificity are what we expect from this period. If the events happened as a basic historical narrative would typically say that they did, the kinds of evidence that we have is about what we would expect. There's nothing weird. There's nothing strange. The things that are slightly, the closer you are, the more immediate, the more precise, but also every person who writes, they each have a concern. They each have an audience. They're not writing for me, Mary Harb. They're not writing for Robert Spencer. They are writing either for themselves or for an immediate audience around them in a specific context. And they're going to address the things such as they are. These people are saying that Mohammed is not saying he's bringing a new religion. He is saying that he is coming with the same text, with just in a different language, that verifies everything. And so everyone should recognize them as the excellent authorities and the authenticity and the reliability. And he's bringing the truth. And so the people call him things that we would expect them to call them, given what they were actually claiming. So again, why are they, and Saint Sophronius, again, he's giving a homily, he's giving a sermon as to why these horrible things are happening to us. So the horrible things that are happening, everybody knows what they are. Everybody knows who these people are. So they're not being listed out, but they're being described in the context of why we should repent and live righteously and God will justify us. Why are the Saracens attacking us? Why were the churches pulled down? Why is the cross mocked? Why is Christ, who is dispenser of all good things and provider of this joyousness of ours, blasphemed by pagan mouths, so that he justly cries out, because of you, my name is blasphemed among the pagans. And this is the worst of all the terrible things that are happening to us. What's the worst thing? Their view and treatment of Christ. That is why the vengeful and God-hating Saracens, the abomination of desolation, so clearly foretold to us by the prophets, overrun the places which are not allowed to them, plunder cities, devastate fields, etc. And now Robert does go to later legends where, Saint Sophronius was walking around and Umar said he wouldn't go into this place. Well, what do Muslims typically do when they arrive in a place? They steal all the holy sites. They build their own things. They knock things down. Hagia Sophia today is what? Is it a church? No, it's a mosque. So if you need to protect your holy site from theft, what do? Hundreds of years later. And again, this is about treating sources in context, because what type of sources they are, with respect. You say, well, Umar said that he wasn't going to take this. You can't question Umar. This is our church. And churches were taken. Churches were stolen. People who were able to mount defenses, sometimes they even fabricated documents that are all thrown out. Like they're all like, this particular church is under the protection of, it was usually Umar because he conquered a lot of places. And historians do not take it seriously as a historical event that Umar protected a particular church, but the Christians used it later on as Muslims are stealing everything as a defense that, well, Umar said you couldn't take this one. Now, did Umar actually take anything immediately? He wasn't particularly concerned with that. He was running around killing lots of people. The forbidding of people from churches happened pretty quickly to many of the churches. They were just destroyed. But the fact is that these things exist in a context, and getting that context right helps us to understand what's going on. When we have these labor fabrications, what are they scared of? The same thing will happen to them as what happened to the church in Damascus, the main church in Damascus, the cathedral of Damascus, which was to John the Baptist, was turned into a mosque. It was stolen. How do we defend ourselves from that? Well, this is how we're going to say this. So again, context and content together, putting things in their places, reading everything that people are saying as each person has their own individual voice. Each person has their own interest. Each person has their own emphasis. But together, they paint a picture of both the many false claims of Muhammad that is generally accurate according to how much information we would expect them to have, and opposed him in the ways that we would expect them to. They were not in agreement with these claims. They were not bowing to these claims. They were recording them sometimes, but they were not endorsing them. They were casting them as associated with the beast, for example. So again, we really need to treat the sources with the seriousness that they deserve by letting them speak and say what they want to say, rather than extracting from them a different message that suits our particular theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Robert Spencer, if you can unmute yourself, please. Your last 15 minutes of rebuttal starts now, sir.
Thank you. And that's exactly it, Mary. Yes, you're absolutely right. The Christians fabricated stories in order to try to protect their holy places. And one of the notable examples that you didn't mention is the monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai, where they have an actual letter of Muhammad with his handprint on it that says, you must protect this monastery. And to this day, it has protected the monastery, although it has no actual authenticity. Other people fabricated stories about Muhammad as well. They were the Muslims. And this is something that the Muslims themselves acknowledge, as, for example, you have Bukhari collecting 600,000 traditions about Muhammad and rejecting 593,000 of them as inauthentic. Now, where did those 593,000 stories come from? It wasn't Christians who were fabricating them, it was Muslims. For what reason did they fabricate them? They did so because they wanted to buttress their own position, justify their own activities, or maybe they were just telling stories to entertain at various times and in various places. In any case, the idea that there are numerous fictional stories of Muhammad is something that every Islamic scholar acknowledges. But then they will adduce the alleged science of the Hadith, where you have the isnad chain, the chain of transmitters, and if every step in those chain of transmitters is somebody who's reliable, then the story is taken to be authentic. And it was on that basis that Bukhari winnowed out his 7,000 stories, and many of those are repeated more than once because the isnad chains are different. And so he wanted to show that they were multiply attested. And that's all very well. But the earliest traditions that are extant today don't have any chain of transmitters at all. And so there's actually no way by the standards of Islam to determine whether they are authentic or not. And there is no reason to take anything in them as being any more historically accurate than anything else in the 593,000 rejected stories, because they don't have any different character. They all depict the same Muhammad doing pretty much the same kinds of things. It also should be noted that one of the things that we see in the Sirah literature to a tremendous degree are a lot of miracles, that Muhammad's doing miracles left and right. And there are so many examples of this. And yet the Quran is quite concerned in several places with ensuring that nobody thinks that the messenger is able to do any miracles. And so clearly there has been a tremendous development in the understanding of the role of the messenger between the time of the composition of the Quran and the time of the collection of these hadiths. And that is where the problem lies, that in that development, you bring in the possibility, you open the door to the possibility of legendary elaboration that is to such a tremendous degree that it obscures any historical accuracy in any of the texts. And that's the point about the story of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. You're quite right. You quoted it accurately. It is the Mus'haf that it says. We did not read from the Mus'haf until the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. And so presumably before that, they're reciting Quran from memory, if they're reciting Quran at all. You have to grant that it could be that he's saying we didn't read the Quran, because just to say it's a little bit ambiguous that we didn't recite from the Mus'haf. Did you have the Quran before that or not? Not answered. But in any case, if they are reciting from it, from memory, then you have the possibility that it could change. And this is one of the reasons why it became necessary to write all this down in any case, so that there would be some end to this unacceptable fluidity within Islamic doctrine and practice. Now, when it comes to the books and whether you're going to refer to a book or a codex as a book or whatever, well, that's all very well, but you still don't have any adequate explanation for the Christian writer in the early 8th century saying that he's familiar with the Quran and Surah al-Baqarah. It's very clear that he's referring to them as separate entities, and that the Quran that he has access to does not have Surah al-Baqarah as the second chapter. And John's writings, as I said before, do open the door to the very real possibility, not only that there was lost material from the Quran, the chapter of the Camel of Allah or the book of the Camel of Allah, but also that the chapters themselves were not a single book. Also, very interesting thing, Mary, that you said there, an extraordinary thing, really, about the coins, that the Christians insisted that the coins not change, and they would have revolted if the coins changed, right? That. I don't want to misrepresent you. That's what you said, right?
Can I answer? Sorry.
Please, go ahead.
Okay. So I said that this is what the Christians said.
Yes.
That
great.
they did.
Okay. So the coins, let's remember, have Muhammad on them. They say Muhammad plus a cross. And so if it is true that they were insisting in connection with those particular coins that the coins not be changed, then presumably they said Muhammad before Islam as well, in which case Muhammad is a title that becomes elaborated into an individual when there is political necessity for such an individual to be developed. Now, as far as Hegarian goes and whether it means immigrant, that's of course, yes, that's great, but it's completely irrelevant because the point is they're not saying Muslim. And to say, well, they didn't refer to themselves as Muslim at that time, actually, by your theory, they did. Because just to take several of many, many available examples, you have chapter 41, verse 33 of the Quran. And who is better in speech than he who prays to his Lord and does right and says, indeed, I am among those who are Muslims. And so we have to believe that the Quran says the believers are called Muslims and has them identifying themselves as Muslims. I said that I'd give you more than one. So here's 4369, 4368 and 9. O my slaves, for you there is no fear this day, nor is it you who grieve, who believed our revelations and were Muslims. And so you got to believe that this book was finished by 632, collected and codified by 653, and yet all through until the early 700s, nobody ever uses that word. It's extraordinary that the word that the Quran itself uses multiple times, you know, and I know, I could read many other passages of the Quran that mention Muslims, that this is the word they use of themselves, but when they go out, they say, apparently, oh, we're Saracens, we're Hagarians, we're Ishmaelites, we're Magaria, whatever you want to say. All these words that the writers from the time refer to them as, and not a single one in the 7th century uses this word Muslim. It's very strange. And maybe, just maybe, it's because this book that has Muslims in it so many times did not yet exist in the 7th century, and thus was not quoted by people who are identifying themselves when they are out conquering and talking with the conquered people. And you also said that the closer that you are to the events, the more immediate and precise your description will be. And that makes sense. You're absolutely right. That's the way it ought to be, because eyewitnesses ought to have the most immediate and precise explanation for whatever it is that they're talking about. And then as it goes on, the story becomes vaguer, the story becomes a little bit less certain as it gets farther and farther from the events, particularly when you're talking about oral tradition. When, however, you have legendary elaboration, then it's just the opposite. And that's when you have the stories changing character and becoming more detailed instead of less detailed as time goes by. And that is exactly the situation, as I mentioned before, that we find in the Islamic literature. For example, I promised an example earlier, so here I will finally give it. Ibn Hisham says, meanwhile, the messenger of Allah had sent Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas on campaign with 8 men from among the Muhajirun. He went as far as Harar in the Hijaz. Then he returned without having had a clash with the enemy. Full stop. That's the whole story. Not a big deal. Just a minor incident in Ibn Hisham's Sirah. 2 generations later, you have Al-Waqidi in his book of the Battles of Muhammad, and he says, then the messenger of Allah appointed Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas to the command against Qarar being part of Jufa near Qum in Zul Khadda, 18 months after the hijrah of the messenger. Abu Bakr ibn Ismail ibn Muhammad said, on the authority of his father, on the authority of Amir ibn Sa'd, on the authority of his father, the messenger of Allah said, O Sa'd, go to Qarar, for a caravan belonging to Quraysh will pass through it. So I went out with 20 or 21 men on foot. We would hide during the day and travel at night until we arrived there in the morning of the 5th day. We found that the caravan had passed through the day before. The messenger had enjoined upon us not to go beyond Qarar. Had we not done so, I would have tried to catch up with it. So Al-Waqidi knows so much more about this incident than Ibn Hisham knows. And he has it on the impeccable authority of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas himself, the leader of the expedition. And so consequently, we have to believe that somehow all this detail existed, but it eluded Ibn Hisham. Despite his best efforts, it eluded all the disciples of Ibn Ishaq, and it got to Waqidi. So it seems to me that your point is absolutely right. The closer you are to the events, the more immediate and precise your account will be, is a tremendous contradiction to the historicity of Muhammad and Islam. The idea is much more plausible that these are stories that were developed over a long period of time by a large number of people, that the stories in the Hadith are full of contradictions because they were produced by rival factions with different agendas, often competing, and then explanations were fabricated for the contradictions themselves, and that's where we get the doctrine of abrogation and things of that kind. And so that actually is a simple explanation, the simplest possible explanation for the events. This is something that makes a whole lot more sense than thinking that they got all of Islam by 632, they codified Quran by 653, and promptly shut up about it entirely for another 50 or 60 years. That doesn't make any sense at all. And so when you're talking about the simplest possible explanation for events, that's what we're looking for here when we question the historicity of Muhammad. And it's not at all a distraction from any important inquiry because...
1 minute, sir.
Thank you. In the first place, you have... it's very important to note that Muslims believe this stuff. And so we still have to talk about its immorality, its irrationality, it's violence, it's calling evil good and good evil, and so on. That's absolutely true. We have to keep doing that. At the same time, it is a tremendous challenge that the Islamic apologists have no response to and have never even attempted to answer, that is making great inroads into Islam itself now. Witness Yasser Qadi, one of the most prominent Muslim clerics in the United States, who has just declared that the Hadith literature cannot be supported by the historical critical method. So you're more of a believer than Yasser Qadi at this point. And that is a very difficult situation to be in, because Yasser knows what the evidence is.
Your time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So that was end of the 3 session of rebuttal. Thank you very much, Mary and Robert. So now we will go for 5 minutes of closing statements. So those of you who are watching us, thank you very much for being here. After closing statements, I will be bringing up your questions. So therefore, if you've got any question, please tag the CCI Ministries and then let me know who you are asking your questions so I can ask them within next 10 minutes. I just ask Robert Spencer to mute himself, please. And then, Mary, your 5 minutes of closing statement starts now.
All right. So I want to point out that Robert is kind of reverting to this binary, that either everything is legendary or nothing is. Like, if I grant that anything could be embroidered, that anything could be misremembered, that anything could be misrecorded, then I can't trust any of it. That's not how we do history. That's not how we treat sources. Oh, well, historians don't take the isnad. Neither do I. I don't take the idea that this isnad process is what is reliable. I don't think that it was oral, and we know it wasn't oral. We know it wasn't. It was written. Robert says that they shut up for 100 years about it, but they didn't. We have surviving hadith collections that had to have been compiled by 7070. Malik ibn Abbas published his hadith collection, among other things. So, and this is based on not just this oral whatever people going, these were written things. We have fragments of writings that are not Quranic from the 7th century itself, saying that what survives is what there is not an appropriate response. And again, Robert is granting later myth-making status by saying that it says Muslim in the Quran. No, it doesn't. It doesn't say Muslim. What it says is surrenderer, the one who surrenders, the surrendering one. That didn't become a label until later, when they needed something. Other people are not taking them as believers. Well, they took it as a rhetorical point. Well, we're the ones who really submit, because we accept all the prophets and all the scripture, except we don't. And so we are the submitting ones. We can't use things in different terms than they were used in. Quran meant a recitation. The entire codex was called a Furqan, but now only one part of it is called a Furqan. Why would there not be another book within the codex called a Quran at the time that someone else was speaking? Whenever we have this uncertainty of terminology at that time too. We shouldn't get lost in the weeds of all of this noise about things. We should use normative historical methods. It's easier to just discount evidence and discount the narratives without treating them with seriousness. But we need to look at the things as we would look at any sources. This is how history is done generally. Was Mohammed more revered? Well, yeah, so was Joseph Smith. So are there certain suspicions about things because of that in particular, because of the kinds of claims that he made? Sure. Do I credit any of the miracle stories? No, but you will notice their qualities as being disjuncted from affecting anything else around it. Like, there's an event and it's a miracle, and this miracle, none of the other stories have any knowledge of this miracle. None of the other stories refer to this miracle. Why? Because that's one of the legendary things. Whenever you have many different stories that were recorded by different people and repeated, that wove together and create a larger meta story and referenced one another, but existed as independent pieces. They weren't woven in the legend and this legend continued. No, they existed as self-referencing pieces. This is evidence of that. And again, these were written sources from the beginning. Did Bukhari have 600,000 hadith that he went through? No, there also weren't 500,000 people at Marathon. But Marathon was a battle that happened. Were there chroniclers that recorded that there were 500,000 people on the Persian side? Yes, but we don't doubt Marathon because there weren't 500,000. The emphasis was in the excellence of these folks who were able to look through specific groups who might have fabricated something and what they might have introduced. Robert Spencer said that this is the result of different factions, but he has not theorized or brought forward any of these factions. We know who these people were. We know what factions existed. We know what different theologies there are. And yet these are very rarely traceable in any hadith and in none of the ones that exist in these clear contexts where they are self-referential. There's a place and a time. They connect to one another. The ones that have the trappings that are the most reliable. Again, we need to speak about Muhammad clearly, because knowing Muhammad and what he really taught and what he really claimed and how far it was from even views 500 years later is one of the main reasons that people leave his teachings. We need to teach him clearly, accurately, in a way that cannot be responded to. And Muslims have responded to many of Spencer's claims in the past.
Your time is up. Thank you very much. Robert Spencer, if you can unmute yourself, I'll give you your 5 minutes of closing statement, please. Time starts now.
I'm sorry. Can you stop it for a second? I just have a question. Mary's timer said 2:35, and you said her time was up.
No, it went down.
It went down.
And then it reset, I think, like...
It was -1 when she stopped.
Oh, okay. I was just wanting to make sure.
No, I got
5 minutes we're talking.
It was only 5 minutes.
Okay, terrific. Okay. Anyway,
thank
you. Sorry about that.
I can't believe you just claimed I was not just.
No, I just want. I would never think such a thing, but mistakes can be made, as we know, and so I want to make sure you know that Mary got all the time that she has. Okay.
Okay, your 5 minutes starts now, sir.
Okay, very good. Everything is either legendary or nothing is, I supposedly am saying. Actually, not what I'm saying at all. And what I am saying is that we cannot know what might be historical because there is no way to distinguish in the vast majority of, in the vast, voluminous hadith literature. There is no way to distinguish material that is wholly fictional and legendary from material that is adapted from other people, from material that may have originally been about some Arab prophet, maybe even one named Muhammad. Maybe there were some things that he did. However, we cannot know what they were, if any. And so that is the great difficulty that those who hold to the standard narrative have, that all of the material that they have is from the 9th century or later. And consequently, and when we know, as I've shown, that there was legendary elaboration, then you can't know where the legend stops and the facts begin. And so it's all questionable. As for the idea that Muwatta Malik is something that is earlier, it's true. Malik died in 795, and there is a fragment, a single page of his entire book that exists from his life, within his lifetime. However, at the same time, the full manuscript of Muwatta Malik dates from 1030, which is considerably later, and consequently open to any number of alterations, elaborations, and so on. And so, in any case, I haven't adduced any factions. You're right, because we can't tell what the factions were in the Islamic literature, except that we can. Obviously, when there are disagreements on various issues, that is evidence that there were differing factions who fabricated different stories. For example, the very hotly disputed issue of whether civilians can be killed in warfare. And you have Mohammed forbidding the killing of women and children in warfare. And then you have, on the other hand, the story that there was a catapult throwing whatever it was, stones into a city that was under siege by the Muslims. And they say, you know, there are women and children in there. And Muhammad says they are of them. In other words, it's okay to kill the women and children if you are fighting them in this war. So clearly there was a faction of the Muslims that opposed killing civilians and those who did not. Also, the most notorious faction for which we have evidence is the Sunnis and the Shia. And that's a noteworthy incident. That's a noteworthy thing, because in the Sunni Hadith collections, you have the records of Muhammad choosing Ali as his successor, which is a Shia thing that the Sunni deny, which is another indication that these controversies likely did not end in, well, that one did not end in 680 when it's supposed to have ended with the formal separation between the two, but was still going on in the 9th century. And that consequently, these things cannot be understood as being historical records, but more reasonably as reflections of the situation at the time when they were compiled. And so this is a very important line of inquiry. I want to thank Mary and thank Khatun. It's can't be stressed how important this is, because it is a fundamental challenge to Islam at its core. And the questions are so many and varied regarding the historicity of Muhammad that Muslims have never been challenged to answer. This is something that could cause seismic change in the Islamic world, as the experience of the statements of Yasser Qadi just recently indicate, that the historical critical method cannot be used to substantiate the Hadith. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay, thank you very much, Mary, and thank you very much, Robert, for taking part in the debate. Really appreciate it.
Can I get a drink really fast before questions are asked? I'm so sorry.
Sure.
Thank you.
As a nice person, I'm giving Mary very basic human rights to go and get her drink. Thank you very much, everyone who is joining us in the chat, by the way. So I do have a couple of questions already came in, and I know who they are going to go, but while Mary is taking her human rights to drink her water, I'll kind of give you a couple of more minutes if anyone wants to bring up more questions. Make sure you tag DCCI Ministries and then let me know that who you are asking your question. Until Mary comes back, let me say thank you very much to Cargo for his generosity. And there is $2 to help Robert Spencer for his computer, which was kind of pulled together by Jean. Thank you very much for your generosity as well. Okay. Robert, just beware, you are muted right now. If you make yourself unmuted, that will be helpful throughout question and answer time.
I am unmuted.
Yeah. Mary, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. So I did not ask you before we started, but you are okay for maximum of 2 minutes for each question, and then other person take 1 minute to respond what has been said, or just 2 minutes is enough for one person to reply?
Whatever you want.
Okay, I'll do 2 minutes, and then the next person will have 1 minute to respond what it has been said. So thank you very much. I am not going to keep eye in the chat from now on if there's any questions coming on. So we take on the questions. We got almost 20 questions here. Let's start with this one. Actually, this is not a question, sorry. I'm just saying thank you very much for your generosity. Sorry, I thought that was a question. Let me put this up as well. Thank you very much for your generosity. Sorry, I need to acknowledge them. Nothing personal. Nothing personal. Okay, question. This is for Mary and for Robert Spencer. So I'm going to give both of you 2 minutes to respond to the question. If Spencer is correct, can his point give any evidence towards the simulation theory or for solipsism as true? I'll keep the question on the screen in case my pronunciations didn't make sense. We do with ladies first. Mary, you've got your 2 minutes to start.
I mean, if correct to solipsism, then you're asking for a truth claim, and then whether or not it matches with something where there aren't truth claims. So I'm really not sure how this would connect one another. Now, my issue with the epistemology. Goodness, I cannot epistemology. Goodness, I'm like completely confusing my words. Sorry, my problem with the epistemology language of knowing whether or not these things are correct is that you have to be consistent in your epistemology with everything. You have to be absolutely consistent with your sources, treating them as the kind of sources they are. If you are able to, I'm kind of failing to connect this to anything that really makes sense. Like, if it's objectively true, is it against objective truth? I'm really quite confused, honestly.
Okay. I'll pause your time. Robert Spencer?
Yeah, I find this a very strange question, and pardon me if I don't understand it, but it seems to me solipsism is the idea of, as far as I recall from college anyway, which is many, many hundreds of years ago, as far as I recall, it's thinking that you can't perceive anything for sure. It's just all in your head, and you cannot know whether your perceptions correspond to reality. And I suspect simulation theory has something to do with that as well. And as Mary said, denial of objective truth. This is not what is at issue here. We're not denying objective truth in the slightest degree, neither one of us. We are disputing the nature of that objective truth. And so I'm not sure this applies to your concerns.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me move to the next question. Okay, question is for Mary. I'll put the question on the screen for you to make sure like you see it. Why would there be any need of a prophet according to Quran? Hence, angels can walk the earth, thus they would give the message directly. Quran doesn't need a prophet.
This is really funny. This is not really a serious question, but it is a funny one. So the Quran says that prophets can only go to their own people. So the angels need their own angel prophets, the jinn need their own jinn prophets, and every human society needs their own human prophet. Muhammad was supposed to be the last prophet of the last place on earth that had never before gotten a prophet. Every other place, the Quran says clearly, has gotten its prophet. It has been judged, and Allah will not judge or destroy a place until after it's received its prophet. So the place where Muhammad is a place that hasn't had a prophet before from his own race of people. And so things like New York City and any other town that was founded, I mean, even what's hilarious is even the famous capital of the Islamic Empire, Baghdad, right? It was founded after Muhammad. So guess what? It needed a prophet according to the Quran and its theology. So yeah, because people, you need to give the prophecy and the correct language, and you could only go to your own people of your same family. Otherwise, like, it doesn't count or something. That according to the Quran, the question is, according to the Quran, why do we need Muhammad? That would be why. It's a terrible argument. I agree.
Okay, thank you very much. Robert Spencer, would you like to make a comment on it?
I think that it's true. The whole thing's a stitch up. Whether it's this kind of stitch up or that kind of stitch up is what we're debating today. But neither of us think that it has any authenticity. And one of the clear indications of that is that the Quran says that the Muslims are the executors of the wrath of Allah in chapter 9, verses 14 and 15. Fight them and Allah will punish them by your hands. Well, why does Allah need to have humans so he can punish wayward humans. It doesn't make any sense. Why can't he do it himself? And so the whole thing is just it's a farrago of nonsense. The question at issue here today is just what kind of farrago of nonsense.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Next question is for Robert Spencer. How similar should be historical Muhammad be for you to say that the Muhammad of Islam? Because I would say that it was him, but legendary stories were edited later. Your 2 minutes starts now, sir.
Well, the thing is, we don't have any indication from the 7th century, as I discussed in the debate, that there was a Muhammad of Islam in the 7th century. And now, as I've said consistently, I see people over here saying, oh, he's changing what he's saying. No, I've never changed what I've said on this issue. I've been consistent from the beginning, written 2 books about it and given many talks about it. And I have always said the same thing. There may have been a Muhammad. He may have had something to do with the origins of Islam. We cannot, however, know anything as to whether that even is the case or to what extent he may have had anything to do with Islam, because the first mentions of this Mahmet, which may not refer to Muhammad at all, do not correspond to anything in Islam. And so if you're going strictly by the historical record, then you don't have any record of the Muhammad of Islam until a couple of hundred years later. And so it may be there was no Muhammad at all. It may be that there were several people whose stories were combined into Muhammad. It may be that one of those people was named Muhammad and may have done some of those things. The problem is we cannot, not only do we not know, but we cannot know. If there were to be discovered some manuscript that could be definitively dated to some early period that had great detail about Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, then certainly I would change my position in light of the evidence. But it was the evidence that led me to this position in the first place, and I haven't seen anything to validate the idea of Muhammad since then.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Mary, your 1 minute starts now.
So we have no attestation of multiple Muhammads in any source, except for people saying that, oh, because one detail doesn't match, because this detail isn't the same, then it must be a different person. If I describe my father and his best friend describes him and his worst enemy describes him, there'll be different pictures of an individual person. There is not a rumor that there were multiple prophets from which this is based on. In any Christian account, any other account, there's one individual reported consistently by both hostile and friendly sources. And therefore, proposing that he might have been entirely legendary, or saying that, this can be multiple figures that are stitched together, because I won't take the evidence that there is, while not providing any evidence of something contrary to it, is not a good way to do history.
Your time is up. Thank you very much. Okay, next question is for Mary. If it could be proven that Muhammad didn't exist, could you also conclude that Allah was made up? Did other cultures worship Allah before Muslims?
Well, yes, other cultures did worship Allah. Allah was a pagan god. He is a documented pagan god. So, and it is the Jews called their god Al-Rab. The Christians who spoke Arabic called him Al-Ilah, never Allah, ever. Allah was a pagan god. There are various forms of this title name, but the god with 3 daughters is an established figure in both the north and the south and everywhere in between. Like we have a pagan god Allah. So this is a real pre-existing name for a real pagan god. The Quran actually points us to how Muhammad managed to syncretize Al-Rab with Allah, which he did not at the beginning. They were distinct entities, and then he combined them to make his own people happy, and to say, and it really goes back to, look at the work of Kister. It's brilliant work. It really goes back to the situation in pre-Islamic pagan Mecca, and the debates and the political factions that were there then that continue to matter later on, and mattered into the Rashidun period and far later than that. So if Muhammad did not exist and he was made up, I would still locate, like if it could be proven and just rip everything out, destroy it all, I would still locate this religion right in the area that it came from. I would say that, well, it was still Mecca. Like, Muhammad's gone. Everything's blasted out of existence. I would still go, nah, Mecca is where it came from, one way or another.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am. Robert Spencer, you've got 1 minute to respond what has been said.
Okay. Yes, Mary's absolutely right. Allah was a pagan god, and this is actually a very important aspect of this whole story, because we discussed the old man at the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf saying that we never read from the Mus'haf until the time of Hajjaj. Now, the thing is, a lot of people have wondered, what is it that you're talking about? Mosques? How could there have been mosques before Islam? Well, actually, what they taught was the worship of Allah and this vague Abrahamic monotheism that's very clear from statements of Muawiyah that are extant, the fifth caliph. And the Muhammad myth was grafted onto that and conflated with it when the Islamic tradition started to be developed.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay, next question is for Robert Spencer. You say there is a legend development in later biographies. That means there must be sources to develop from. So what is the source, if not a non-miraculous human?
Well, the source was a non-miraculous human. Hi, Thaddeus. The legendary development in later biographies I already established by reading from them and showing that the later biographies have a great deal more detail than the earlier ones. The sources that they developed from are precisely the ones that Mary adduced that are lost to us today. The earlier material that was written about Muhammad by Urwa and people like that. But the fact that they are lost doesn't mean that they didn't exist. I never denied that they exist. I discussed them in Muhammad, a critical biography, and Did Muhammad Exist? The sources that what they said, we cannot know because, of course, we don't have them. And we do have a lot of legendary elaboration in the sources that we do have. Consequently, it's only reasonable to think that it's very likely that there was legendary elaboration between those sources that are lost and the first sources that we do have. But they did develop from humans. The humans were later than Muhammad, and they were, as we've discussed in other contexts, the people during the Umayyad Empire and mostly the Abbasids, in varying factions, who developed this myth as a means to unify their empire politically at a time when the common religion was indeed the glue of empires. And so this is very much a human development. It's just not the human development that comes from some guy named Muhammad who thought or wanted to fool people into thinking that Allah was talking to him.
Thank you very much. Mary, your 1 minute starts.
So he grants that there are sources like Urwa, but then he says that Ibn Ishaq must have written down everything he knew, and anyone else who had any later information, all of that later stuff must have been a fabrication. Even though, interestingly, whenever he argues for points, he very often takes a hadith that are very, very late and only attested in quite late material and not in some of the earlier materials. And I would say that this isn't the only sources that we have are like the sources that there are later. We don't have something that's different. We don't have anything that's written outside of this Mohammedan figure. Even whenever he's given goofy powers and people are talking about how great he smells, even that comes from the context of its time period. Even his lovely smelling sweat comes from a context that makes sense for
Your
what the
time is
material
up.
is.
Thank you. Next question is for Mary. How can we rely on Tabari or any other sources? Why do we trust history of Mecca that doesn't seem to be historical city of pilgrimage for polytheists? Your 2 minutes starts now, ma'am.
Okay, you're stipulating that Mecca wasn't a historical city of pilgrimage. You're just saying this. There is, again, was it a city of pilgrimage of people who did not have much practice of writing? Yes. But this matches a regular Iron Age pagan site to its structure, to the types of activities that people did, to the very idle black stone itself is very typical of the kind of thing belonging to a certain time and place. Secondly, yes, it was recorded in the Islamic age when people started writing things down. But again, look at Kister's work on the pre-Islamic Arabs who regarded, and their different tribes who were not the Quraysh had different traditions and different stories about what they used to say when they used to go to not just Mecca, but other pagan sites. We went to this site, we went to that site, we went to that site. And here is our cheer when we went there, because we each have our own special cheer. Like, we have these records, and from very different tribes from different areas who were still pagan, and there weren't a huge number of them. They all have stories that separately mesh together into a picture of this historical city. And by the way, the Qiblas point to Mecca from the earliest mosques as much as they do from 18th century mosques in the same region. They point in generally the same directions. So I just wanted to make that point clear.
Okay, thank you very much. Robert Spencer?
Well, Mecca indeed was inhabited by people who were not given to writing, and I suppose Mary mentioned that in order to account for the fact that it's completely absent from the historical record until the 9th century. But it's more than just the Meccans that are responsible for that. Patricia Crona, in her Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, speaks about the tradesmen who traveled from Constantinople into India on the Spice Road and back, and kept meticulous records of where they went and where they made sales. And they never mentioned Mecca. They never went there. And yet in the Hadith literature, it's supposed to be a thriving center for trade as well as pilgrimage. So that's very extremely strange that nobody seems to know about this thriving center of trade at the time when it was supposed to be a thriving center of trade.
Thank you very much, sir. Next question. Next question is for Robert Spencer. Are Muslims not commanded to make things up because they have to emulate Muhammad? Your 2 minutes starts now, sir.
Well, that's not quite what the teaching is. The teaching of the Quran and Islamic tradition is that if you are under pressure, you can deceive unbelievers, which is a different thing from just saying they're commanded to make things up. They can pretend to be, as Maulana Maududi, the 20th century Islamic scholar, said in his interpretation, in his commentary on chapter 3, verse 28 of the Quran, which says, do not take unbelievers as your friends and protectors in preference to believers. Whoever does this has nothing to do with Allah unless you're doing it to guard yourselves against them. And Maududi says, that means you can pretend to be on the side of your enemies. But he's not just saying make stuff up willy-nilly. That was not the idea. And while it's entirely likely that many of the stories of Muhammad were fabricated out of nothing, and that's one of the reasons for this proliferation of nonsense that Bukhari himself rejected. At the same time, it's likely that much of what we have in the Hadith literature was pre-existing material, folk tales, and tales of other legends of other people that were folded into the story of Muhammad. This is why, as I said before, you have things like these weird other names popping up, Kutam and Saraphel and so on. That's in order to account for the existence of material that contains these variant versions of the events or variant names being mentioned. The standard Islamic narrative has no explanation for those things, as I mentioned before. So no, Muslims are not really just commanded to make stuff up.
Thank you very much, sir. Mary?
And yeah, Muslims are not commanded to make stuff up willy-nilly, and they're really not supposed to about Muhammad, even though people want to go, well, Muhammad once gave me a thing of water, and when he did, the water didn't run out for 2 days or something like that. Like that's the kind of thing that people want to say, and the kinds of exaggerations and things that we do have. So why are people saying this? Because they met Muhammad and he gave them some water, and they turned that into, and the water didn't run out for 3 days. And we do have this kind of confidence in the reliability of the overall picture because of the consistency of the kind of man that Muhammad was. You know, was he internally consistent with everything he said? Humans aren't. Joseph Smith had published a book that said, you know, no polygamy, and then he was a polygamist. But it matches, and the stories are able to be rectified with one another, as I mentioned before.
Thank you very much. Your time is up. Next question is for Mary. Would a court of law find Muhammad guilty of existing by normal evidential standards?
Yes, I absolutely believe that it would. And part of this is because of the ahadith that contain, like specifically the 3 ahadith about the account of Muhammad laughing when a certain event happened. Those are classic eyewitness variants that you get. Many of the stories about him that they weave together to form larger narratives that each individual piece is unaware of. And that's very important. So if I say that Muhammad did something here, and someone else says that Muhammad did something here, and someone else says he did something here, and each piece has a link together that shows a greater Muhammad, and these are distinct sources that do not really account for what's going on in their own, and might even be like weird and confusing in its own. Like some of the weirdest ahadith, like of Ka'b, who is infested with fleas, and he's scratching his skull, and he's just covered or lice, and he won't cut off the lice. Well, we find out that Muhammad previously, to get away from the fact that all of his followers were very, very, very ill and he couldn't heal them, he said that, well, Allah sends this torment on you to get rid of your sins. And if I heal you, you won't get your sins forgiven from this. And in fact, we prophets suffer more than anyone. And there was a prophet who was bitten to death by fleas and all of this really exaggerated stuff. So people were taking this guy seriously. What are they going to do when they're afflicted by lice? If a prophet was bitten to death by fleas, well, he's not going to treat his lice. That's why Muhammad instructs him, oh, cut your hair, but then give sacrifice, feed some poor people, so that you still get the benefits that now you've rejected by cutting your hair based upon this thing I made up earlier.
Thank you very much. Robert Spencer?
Yeah, you know, I love the talk about the weird hadith. Weird hadith are just an endless source of entertainment. I got a great one for you. This is the weirdest hadith of all. Muhammad says, I have fabricated things against Allah and have imputed to him words which he has not spoken. That's in Tabari. Now, I got to ask you, why would the real Muhammad ever say such a thing? Not a chance. But if you are in an enterprise of fabricating material about this figure and some of it contradicts and you want to drop some of it, and Mary talked about how some of it was dropped, some of it was lost, and so on, then you need to explain that. And so you have to come up with stories like the satanic verses and a principle of abrogation and this wild hadith, which is one of my favorites of all. It's actually the epigraph to my biography of Muhammad, a critical biography, which none of you have read and I should read.
Your time is up, sir. Thank you very much. Next question is for you. Thank you very much for your generosity. Question is if there is no Muhammad, how can you describe Shia and Sunni conflict? Your 2 minutes starts.
The Sunni-Shia conflict, according to Islamic tradition, is because Ali insulted Aisha, and they became bitter enemies. And ultimately, this led to the split. I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but you can look that up. Now, the fact is that all of that is 9th century legends. And what is most striking about the legends regarding the origins of the Sunni-Shia conflict is that, as I mentioned before, the Sunni Hadith collections contain the traditions about Muhammad appointing Ali as his successor. They also contain the traditions contradicting that. Now, you can believe that Muhammad was sort of incoherent and self-contradictory and completely unclear, and that may well be. But you also, to make sense of this, could understand that this is not a conflict that's going on in the 7th century. It's a conflict that's going on in the 9th century and is not yet resolved at the time that the Hadith collections are being made. And so both points of view are represented in what ultimately became the Sunni Hadith collections as well as the Shiite Hadith collections, and the whole thing is unresolved. The idea that the Sunni-Shiite conflict, because it exists, therefore means that all the principles exist and that Muhammad must have existed, actually has no basis in fact whatsoever, because it's very clear that the existing explanation from the 9th century is highly legendary and colored by other considerations, and consequently it doesn't explain anything itself.
So your time up. Thank you very much. Mary, 1 minute.
So the Sunni-Shia conflict goes back. There's a reason why Ali was against Aisha, and it stems back from Muhammad's marriage to Salama and his failure to remove her jealousy and her friendship with Fatima and Fatima's dislike of Aisha. There's a huge body of this that is fragmentary throughout. So this animosity was part of it, and Aisha supporting her father and her friend's father, Hafsa was in her faction against the faction of wives that she hated. And so that is the source. The early political factions, which groups were the Abu Bakr Umar faction? Well, that was mostly the Quraysh, who was the Ali faction, very often people who were outside of the inner circle. And yes, it says that Ali was his heir, but they interpreted heir differently. Heir versus ruler being interpreted separately. I could go into so much more, the Khazarites, everything else, all of this 1st century AH
Your
history.
Thank you very much. Isaiah, thank you very much for your generosity. Yeah, pray for Muslim women. They need to get out of Islam. Jesus Christ comes to rescue and redeem them, yet they stuck in Islam. We need to pray for them. Next question is for Mary, right? Yeah. Timing. If the Quran is about Muhammad, why does it contain 0 biographical details about Muhammad?
So the issue is one of genre. What Muhammad mistakenly thought that the Quran was, or what scripture was in general. So the Quran matches Islamic poetry in a lot of its forms. It is partly very poetic, partly homiletic, where he's screaming at people about how they need to do what he wants them to do and condemning people and things like that. But there are kind of subgenres within it. But generally, he thought that scripture must be a genre that he's familiar with. And so he's trying to reveal what he says are in the other sources. And that they recognize me should be something that's in the other sources. Muslims are kind of perplexed whenever they first read the Bible because it's a coherent narrative and it has coherent things in it, because they don't think that that's the type of thing that scripture is. Now, the question is, if the Quran could have been made by anyone, and if a Mohammedan figure is part of it, as Muhammad was in this era, why wouldn't it give his details if it wanted to be something that was outside of this Arab genre of what they think literature is. Well, it's because it was made by a Muhammad, that he thought that this is how, he'd walk past a church and he'd hear people chanting, and that was as much scripture as he got. He'd go travel past the Jews, and they also have similar worship forms, and he thought that that must be what the scripture was, so he wanted to do something familiar. The Tajweed method was invented by Muhammad to sound like and imitate what the Jews and Christians were doing. So it's all an issue of the ideas that were in Muhammad's head.
Okay, thank you very much. Robert Spencer?
The Quran contains no biographical details about him because it predates the biography. And the 4 mentions of Muhammad in the Quran are all can all be understood completely coherently as titles referring to the messenger, who is referred to so many times in the Quran. Many translations try to obscure this by adding Muhammad's name all over the place, but actually he's only mentioned 4 times. All 4 contain no biographical details, as you've said. All 4 could be a title of the messenger who is not divine, who may be in fact Jesus himself, as that seems to be the import of the Dome of the Rock inscription that starts out by saying Muhammad is just the messenger of Allah, and then goes on about Jesus being not divine. It's the messenger is not divine is the idea.
Sorry, your time is up. Thank you very much. Question to both of you. Kargo, thank you very much for your generosity. Any tangible object to prove Muhammad? Art, anything, any museum? Can any museum provide anything to us? If not, why not? For plausible deniability. So let's do ladies first. Mary.
Okay, as I've shown, Muhammad was a regular human name. It was only used in this way. It's introduced by very recent people who are wanting to, or who are in the Muhammad mythicist camp, that it might have been a title, but this is not historically supported, nor was it ever understood in this way. Therefore, we have many written things about Muhammad from fairly early dates. The earliest coin would be the Uthmanic coin that had his name on it. Does he have a tomb? Yes. Will Muslims let anyone dig it up? No. Muhammad's tomb is testified to in Medina at a location that was Aisha's house, and many people talk about getting the tour of the tomb and her showing them the marks on the wall where Muhammad used to wipe his semen. Like, this is, and again, the people that I'm showing you, like I showed you their names, they lived in Medina. They were the children of the people who were with Muhammad. So they were living with Aisha and seeing this place that she says is his tomb, and looking at the marks of the wall of his semen and going, yes, this is what we believe in. This isn't a later location. This isn't a different location. These people were saying that, yes, we agree that this place with the semen stains, those semen stains are truly the semen stains of our prophet. And this is true. And I think that is pretty significant.
Thank you very much. Robert Spencer, is there any tangible object to prove Muhammad?
There is the tomb of Muhammad right there in Mecca. Wow, unrefuted. Except we don't know who's in there. And the fact is that the tomb itself dates from the 9th century, just like all of this other material about Muhammad. And so consequently, we cannot know who is in the tomb. And clearly it could be anybody. We can't compare his dental records or something. There's no way to tell. Meanwhile, the other material all dates from after the time of Abdul Malik, or at the time of Abdul Malik. And that's when the Muhammad myth starts to be formulated. And so I mentioned the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is a very interesting place for a number of reasons. One of them being that it's a mosque without a Qibla, which seems to suggest that it was supposed to be the focus of the prayers itself when it was built, and that was changed later, probably when Abdul Malik overcame the rebellion of Abdullah ibn Zubair and took over Mecca, and then transferred the focus of the religion to Mecca to incorporate Abdullah's followers into it. But the Dome of the Rock has inscriptions that say Muhammad is a prophet. This is 60 years after Muhammad is supposed to have died. And as I explained in connection with the earlier question, this is something that doesn't necessarily refer to the Prophet of Islam unless you believe that it mentions the Prophet of Islam and then immediately, without explanation, changes the subject to talk about Jesus for quite a number of lines after that and never goes back to Muhammad. And so maybe it's just all about Jesus from beginning to end. That would actually make more sense.
Thank you very much, sir. Question for you, Robert Spencer. You said that it is known that Muslims made up some stories. That is true. It is also known that Christians made up some stories. So why do stories invalidate Islam only? Your 2 minutes starts now, sir.
It's not the stories. It's not the fact of stories. It's the date of the stories. The reason why we can't know anything about the historical Muhammad, or if there was a historical Muhammad at all, is because the stories that we have date from 2 centuries or more after he's supposed to have lived. When you look at the actual extant manuscripts of the Hadith collections, you're talking about 4 to 6 centuries after Muhammad is supposed to have lived, and any room in there for legendary elaboration. Now, you take in contrast the Gospels in the New Testament. You have historians generally agreeing that 3 of the 4 were written before 70 AD. And John A.T. Robinson, who was an Anglican scholar, actually argues that all 4 were written before 70 AD. And I think his argument is quite compelling. And that's within the lifetime of people who knew Jesus and could attest to the reliability or the unreliability of various stories. And so you have vastly different situation. You have, on the one hand, you have people who knew the apostles, heard stories from the apostles, and are writing down those stories at a time when other people who could check them were still alive, versus people collecting oral traditions that had undergone any amount of change before the collection even started, and continuing to fabricate material to supplement all that to the degree that you can't know what is historical and what isn't in the Islamic tradition. And so it's a reasonable comparison. I'm going to be debating Hakikaju about this at DebateCon.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Mary, your 1 minute.
And this will end up being a problem for Robert if he continues with the arguments that he has, because he argues from fragments of the gospel collection of the Gospels that are dated early, that it must have been before 70 AD. But we have 20% from right when we expect it to be that he will argue is not the Quran. He says that it might have been incorporated into it. And again, that would be like finding 20% of John and saying, well, it's not John. Maybe it's a proto-John. Maybe this is a proto thing. But that is not what we actually have. We can date the Quran early, and we should not confuse that, because if we do, we will lose. And that's a problem. And I have lots of other things to say on other inaccuracies, but I really want you to be careful with that one when you debate. I will give you resources. Please don't make that argument.
Your time is up. Your time is up. I think I need to do some videos on Quranic manuscripts, so there are lots of things that are circulating around, needs to be fact checked. Okay, so that was for Robert. Mary, question for Mary.
And just, I'll write you later.
Okay, Mary, do you think the lack of archaeology in the Quran, Saudi Arabia, only substantial Robert's claim?
Sorry, my turn.
Yeah.
No, because there have been archaeological digs. We do know, like, the historical location of Mohammed or Khadija's house was recorded. It was dug up. It was photographed, and things were taken out of it and stuck in a museum before it was paved over and filled in carefully. But like, what archaeology would you expect to find that you don't find? That's the real question. Now, the fact that the places mentioned in the Quran, like the Quran has terrible geography, and when it has even worse historiography, it doesn't know when things happen. And the fact that some of the locations, like one of them is probably in the Hadramaut, and we have probably found it. And of course, the story of it, it's just a very distorted legend. But the fact that it's way down there really points to Muhammad being from around Mecca. The preoccupation with Yemen points to him being around Mecca, which was under the power of Yemeni kingdoms for most of its history. And so the archaeology that we have is what we'd expect. You know, he's spoken about, oh, this should be on a trade route. No one ever said it was on a trade route except Montgomery Watt. He's the first guy who said that it's on a trade route. It is on a very minor branch line between a major trade route and a secondary trade route. There's like a little attaching trail that very few people went through. And the Quranic sources do not put any trade there. They put it next to Taif at a market that was over there that the people in Mecca controlled. So they controlled a market away from their own home. So I think that what we find is what we would expect to find. If they did more digs and more honest archaeology, you'd know more about the mud huts, but they don't want you to know about the mud huts.
Thank you very much. Robert Spencer, 1 minute.
Yeah, absolutely. The lack of archaeology, the lack of archaeological confirmation substantiates everything I'm saying. But the fact is that my arguments regarding the New Testament in connection with the other question don't have anything to do with manuscripts. And you're just going to have to wait until the debate to see about that. But in any case, condescension is easy. Making arguments is difficult. The lack of archaeology and the Saudis' lack of interest in it is something that makes it clear that they don't want people digging. And they don't want people digging because they know they're not going to find anything that corroborates the Quranic record. And that's because the Quranic record does not actually correspond to any history. Oh, Mecca was indeed a trade route. Muhammad is in the Hadiths going to Syria.
So your time is up. Thank you very much. Well, I don't know who this question is for, but it's per chat, so I need to take. Thank you very much for your generosity. Like, if Mecca hadn't got a prophet before Muhammad, then what was Ishmael and Abraham? Mary, do you want to have 1 minute to respond to this? And then I'll give 1 minute to Robert Spencer as well.
Yeah, you'll find that Muhammad makes arguments that he himself, sometimes in the space of like a few words, will kind of undermine as well. His argument would be that a different group of people were there, and Ishmael was not a prophet who declared the Allah to his own people, but was something else. That's the kind of thing that you would find Muslims say. Muhammad had very clear theologies, but then like any application of them ended up getting muddled in his own examples in the Quran itself, because he was a regular human who wasn't exceptionally intelligent. I will put it that. And I apologize, Robert. I was absolutely not trying to be condescending in any way, just so you know.
Okay. So Robert Spencer, you've got 1 minute. Do you want to kind of comment on this question?
Yeah, Ishmael and Abraham don't have anything to do with Mecca. These are more Islamic legends and myths. Mecca is actually not mentioned in the Quran, and is noteworthy in that regard, as the idea of it as a center of trade as well as pilgrimage is absolutely indispensable for the Hadith, because it's why the Quraysh get so mad at him, and ultimately he has to go to Medina and so on. And so if Mecca doesn't actually exist in the way that it's described in the Hadith, then the huge foundation of the whole story collapses. And indeed, there is no evidence of Mecca as such at the time that it is all that is supposed to have happened. But no, there's no connection between Abraham or Ishmael and the actual Mecca at all.
Okay, thank you very much. Isaiah, thank you very much for your generosity. Mohammed, I received revelation from Allah. I wrote a Winken Donkey journey to night journey. I don't have eyewitnesses, but please trust me, bro. Yeah, I do buy those kind of things. We trust. We trust. Dangerous days. Thank you very much for your generosity as well. Question: if Aisha scrapped mystery Jews of Muhammad's skirt, does that make her world's first dry cleaner? Love you all. I think, Robert Spencer, I remember you to explaining this gushing sperms of Siemens of Muhammad. Would you like to kind of comment on that? Would you see Aisha as the first dry cleaner, or not very good?
Well, this is one of the main stories I'm sorry, should I start again with the timer?
Yeah, I'll give you 1 minute. I'll give 1 minute to Mary as well.
This is one of the primary stories that people who rely on the criterion of embarrassment like to adduce. Why would anybody make up these stories about Muhammad being so out of control that there's semen everywhere all the time? Well, there are a couple of possibilities. One is that these were stories that go back to somebody that gets put into the Muhammad myth, but why would they be validated for that? It's a matter of his being. See, we have to not see these things as 21st century Westerners. We have to see these things in the way that they would have been seen at the time. And there you have a man who's a real man's man. He's so virile that the semen's positively bursting out of him. And this is not something that's to be ashamed of, or something that's disgusting, or something that makes him out to be gross. It's virile.
Thank you very much. Mary?
And I agree that it wasn't embarrassing, but I disagree with Robert about the context. The context is people wanted to know when you have to wash your clothes to be clean. And the fact that that the narrative does not have awareness of laundering, because that wasn't a practice of the Arabs in this desert area, again, points to historical Muhammad in this area who doesn't do laundry as such. It's complicated. I won't go into what they actually did, but and so, no, it was an important issue for them. And the fact that he had semen on him, I mean, like all of these guys were kind of doing that, and they weren't bothered by it. And again, this points to a particular context and a particular culture and a particular behavior. So like that's really, I would never argue that this is an embarrassing thing to anyone. Other things would be, if you knew he was being tricked, but this isn't embarrassing to them.
Your time is up. Thank you very much. I think officially that was the kind of end of the questions. I told people to I'm not going to take questions anymore from now on. So thank you very much, everyone who put their questions up. And thank you very much to Mary Harp and Robert Spencer for answering them, as well as going through this 3 hours, 25 minutes, 42 seconds of this debate. So really appreciate you made yourself available and your time as well. So before I send everyone to their own way, I just wanted to remind people something. Doesn't matter whether you believe Muhammad existed or Muhammad doesn't exist. Doesn't matter which kind of camp you are standing. Both ways, Muhammad is losing. Both ways, Islam is losing. And we've got last couple of days, we are reminded we need to give huge credit to Yasir Qadi for helping us that we cannot historically trace back the sayings of Muhammad back to Muhammad. So those are great, great days we are living. And so Islam loses both ways, and facts still stands. Jesus Christ is the eternal Son of God, and people won't have eternal life if they don't believe his identity and if they don't believe his work. So therefore, wherever you stand, go out and make sure you preach glorious gospel of Lord Jesus Christ to Muslims, whether they believe Muhammad exists or they are questioning the historical side of it. King of Kings opens his arms and he wants them to repent and turn to him. Once again, Mary Hart, thank you very much for joining me, as well as Robert Spencer. Thank you very much for joining me. By God's grace, I will see you in coming days for another live stream. God bless you all.